Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor is the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster in London. In 2006, he came to Australia as a special guest of the Aquinas Academy. Whilst here, he gave 3 public lectures. This is the third of those lectures, given in Brisbane on September the 2nd. It is entitled Communion and Mission.
Archbishop John, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much, Archbishop, for that very generous introduction and reminding me of my great-grandfather and the liquor. Actually, when I was a boy, going up to Cork, my father used to point out my grandfathers and great-grandfathers. They ran this, it was really a wine business, but it was Murphy and O'Connor, and underneath it was suppliers of wine and spirits to the gentry and clergy of Southern Ireland. So there you are. But I'm delighted to be here in Australia again. I came once 20 years ago. I have a cousin called Father Jerome Murphy O'Connor. He's a Dominican and very well known in Australia. And I was staying, when I arrived, I stayed at the seminary in Sydney. I didn't meet Jerome, my cousin, but he left a little note, because I was giving some lectures and he'd just been giving a series of lectures. And on the note it said, "Welcome to Australia. The name is good. Don't blow it." So I hope I don't blow it this time. But it's nice to have you all here, and I understand you've had to have tickets to come. I'm reminded of my own installation as Archbishop of Westminster nearly 7 years ago now, and nobody could get into the Westminster Cathedral without a ticket. But this lady, an Irish lady, came, and she was a bit late, and she went to the steward and said, "Can I get in?" And the steward said, "Have you your ticket?" And she said, No, I haven't." "But so you can't get in?" She said, "Oh, please," she said, "I've come all the way from Ireland." So they relented and let her in. I met her afterwards, and I said, "Well, if you had no ticket, how did you get in?" "Well, I said I'd come all the way from Ireland, but didn't tell them I'd come all the way from Ireland 40 years ago." So you never know how you're going to get in. Now, the last time I was in Brisbane, nearly 20 years ago, as I was saying, I came to give a lecture on ecumenism. I had a great welcome from Archbishop Batherby's predecessor, Archbishop Rush. Just I've had a great welcome from Archbishop John today. Sadly, for me, while I was speaking to the audience on that occasion, I experienced for the only time in my life jet lag. That my voice seemed to come from another place, and it was very, very difficult to connect with my audience. So I'm very happy to say today I've no jet lag. My voice comes from some echo in my own mind and heart. I've chosen the topic communion and mission, partly because it's so much in accord with the vision of your own Archbishop and his vision for your diocese, summed up in his words of the Jesus, communion and mission vision. And so I suppose my lecture tonight is underlying, I hope, what is his own and the vision of your great archdiocese. So I want to do 4 things in this lecture. First of all, I want to look a little historically to review how we've come to be what we are as a Catholic community. Secondly, I want to examine some of the challenges that we as a Catholic community face in our world today. Third, I want to look at some of the priorities of a diocese like this and my own in order to be faithful to our heritage, our tradition, and to respond, namely communion in the church, but also to reach out in mission to the world, as it were, in which we live. And finally, I want to ground what I say here in an ecclesiology which is shaped by the Trinity and manifested in the church through the Marian and Petrine principles. So let me put things, first of all, for me in a historical context. I'm the 10th Archbishop of Westminster, and I cannot help thinking of how different things were when the first Archbishop of Westminster, Cardinal Nicholas Wiseman, was appointed Archbishop in 1850. He was full of enthusiasm for the renaissance of the church in England. The re-establishment of the hierarchy by Pope Pius IX impelled him to write a pastoral letter called Out of the Flaminian Gate. It was a rather rash letter, and it caused much uproar amongst the establishment of Britain at that time. It gave the impression that the Catholic Church was going to come right back to its proper position as the church in England and displace the established church. And attitudes to Catholics at that time in England can be seen in the view that the establishment had of converts to Catholicism. In 1873, the Times of London could thunder that a statesman who becomes a convert to Roman Catholicism forfeits at once the confidence of the English people. To become a Roman Catholic and remain a thorough Englishman are, it cannot be disguised, incompatible conditions. So there you are. I suppose in Ireland it would have been the other way round, if you were Catholic and became a Protestant. You know the story of the West of Ireland parish priest, and he wanted money for his particular project, and they had a collection all around the village. Anyway, the following Sunday he read out what they'd given. Mrs. McHugh, €1. Mr. O'Brien, €2, and he went on. And eventually he said, Mr. Taylor, €1,000. And he looked up and said, Mr. Taylor is a Protestant. Would to God you were all Protestants, he said. But things have changed. Cardinal Wiseman's letter touched a neuralgic point in English consciousness, and there was such a strong reaction that he was put on the back foot and had to write another letter trying to reassure Protestant England that continental Catholicism was not about to run roughshod over English susceptibilities. His new letter was called An Appeal to the Good Reason and Fairness of the English People. And in this he said that the task of the Catholic community was to look after the Catholics, especially the poor who had come in from other countries, and at that time particularly from Ireland. Now this was much more acceptable than his earlier pastoral letter, and did not worry the establishment or the equilibrium. So the first two strategies of the church in England was the conversion of England. We used to pray so regularly for the conversion of England. And the second was to look after our own Catholic people. And in a sense, these strategies or understandings governed Catholic life for the next 140 years or so. From 1850 onwards, the Catholic Church in England and Wales had, for the most part, been engaged in looking after our Catholic people. It was the kind of Catholicism that I grew up in. We built our churches, we established our schools, and the religious orders flourished. However, we were, on the whole, content to remain on the periphery of social or public life in England and Wales. Yes, we prayed for the conversion of England, but it was a bit of a pipe dream. And the converts that came were more a token of a dream than a reality. I don't know your history so well, but it would seem to me that there was somewhat a similar pattern here in Australia, though perhaps not with the same historical prejudices. The Catholic Church, from small beginnings, grew and developed along traditional lines. Clergy and religious followed their newly immigrant population to this new land of opportunity and growth. The Catholic community built its schools and churches and was content, for the most part, to remain somewhat separate from much of society, at least until the last 40 years or so. I mean, this is simplistic, and I'm very well aware of the influence of the church in this country, particularly in matters of education. But today, it's quite clear that things are very different. The Catholic community is no longer on the periphery. It can no longer afford to be comfortable or to feel safe there. The Catholic Church in England and Wales, as here in Australia, is at the heart of what it means to be Christian in our two countries. Yes, we share much, thank God, with our fellow Christians, but our voice, our presence, and our witness are more important than ever before. In a strange way, the Catholic community, notwithstanding its weaknesses and challenges, punches above its weight and will do so more and more in the years ahead. This is something of the particular tradition in our lands and how we are called to live out our communion in the Catholic Church in the particular circumstances of our local society, our local churches. To that we must be faithful. I like the phrase of Mother Teresa of Calcutta when she said, God, what's her vocation? She said, God has called me not to be successful, but to be faithful. And we have to be aware about the wish to be successful in all our enterprises when what God calls us is to be faithful to our communion and to our mission. The second theme explores our mission to this world to which we are sent to bring the good news of Jesus Christ and the hope of meaning that is at the heart of his good news. Is it not a strange thing that we in our Western culture become richer and able to possess what we want when we want, and yet in so doing our societies are not necessarily happier? I remember going to South America on numerous occasions, to Peru, where priests of my former diocese were working there. And on my return, I used to contrast the simplicity of life, the sense of gratitude, and even the joy of the people in Peru with the lack of so many of these qualities in my own society, which seemed to blind us with a surplus of all that glitters. One of my fellow European cardinals, Cardinal Daniels of Belgium, described us in the so-called developed world as depressive societies, because we all tend to go around manifesting something of the angst of human existence. It is true that if you get off a plane anywhere in Europe, this is what strikes you as you walk through the arrivals hall. How different to step off a plane in Lagos or Lima, where one is immediately struck by a kind of joy, despite the poverty and the difficulties of the people. I haven't been in Australia long enough, yet I suspect that in this society you have something of both. Maybe a little of the depression of North Atlantic and European values, but also the optimism, the hope, the spontaneity of the continents of the South. I remember stepping off a plane in Lima airport, and we were waiting there. I was with another priest, and two little boys of about 10 or 11, thin as rakes, came up and asked, we were sitting having a coffee, could they clean our shoes? They were sort of shoe shine boys, and we didn't want that, and I was going to give them a little money, but I asked them, when did they last eat? This was about 7 o'clock in the evening, so they said they'd had something for first thing in the morning. And so my priest companion said to them, would you like something to eat? And one little boy said, yes, we would. So he said, what would you like? So he said, a toasted sandwich. So he said, come and sit with us. So they sat down, the two little boys, and wolfed down a toasted sandwich. And then he said, would you like another? Oh, yes. So they like it. So they had two. But what struck me was when they'd finished and they got up, and they sort of smiled beautifully at us. Thank you very, very much. Bowed and went off. There was a sense of gratitude, and I found that all over that land. Our world, as the poet Gerald Manley Hopkins reminds us, is charged with the grandeur of God. So amid the pain and the brokenness and the alienation, there is always a rumour of God, a search for the spiritual and the transcendent. While there are many who maybe subconsciously try to move God from their life, there are very, very many who wish to quench their thirst for real freedom by endeavouring to satisfy their deepest needs. In some ways, I think of recent years there's been something of a moral awakening or reawakening among a great number in our society, because they begin to see the issues of life and meaning and the spirituality of a culture are at stake. I recently was able to evoke something of that moral reawakening by talking about the issue of abortion in Britain. There are now nearly 200,000 abortions a year, and people are beginning to see that there is something wrong, not just in such a number, but the implications and consequences of such a society that permits so many. It's not just a question of lowering the age limit. As for Catholics, this is just a step in its total abandonment. But it's rather seeing that life begins from its very beginning and that women need to be offered viable alternatives to abortion. The constraints that many women are put through are just a sad reflection on the kind of community that promotes and pressurizes such a solution to unwanted pregnancies. That's only one example of a certain stirring in society, which will always be there, a search for something beyond the material and a present that reaches out for a more ultimate meaning and hope. Deep down, there is unease in our developed world, which is very evident. Even when God is denied, we cannot escape from the questions existence forces upon us. T.S. Eliot describes it in this way: endless invention, endless experiment, brings knowledge of motion but not of stillness, knowledge of speech but not of silence, knowledge of words and ignorance of the word. All our knowledge brings us nearer to our ignorance. All our ignorance brings us nearer to death, but nearness to death no nearer to God. It does seem strange that science and technology, which have brought so many benefits to society, but have also raised ultimate questions. 2 years ago, I was asked to participate in a debate on the occasion of the 250th anniversary of the Royal Society of Arts, which is a society in Britain founded at the time of the Enlightenment to promote science and technology. And it was an extraordinary occasion, about 3,000 people in the Albert Hall. But before I gave my 10-minute speech, there was an eminent scientist, an eminent astronomer, an eminent humanist, and an eminent leader of a business, the chief executive of something called Starbucks. Anyway, when I came on at the end of the morning, I spoke also about the benefits of science and technology and progress. But I also said something else. How extraordinary it was that those things which those of the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, which wished to put religion, privatize religion, those issues had now come down back to haunt us. Like, for instance, we're all green now in our world because we realize this planet, this earth, has been given to us and can't be ravaged. Or how extraordinary that with massive billions of pounds or dollars given to armaments or going to the moon, and a quarter of our planet die in starvation, and another quarter live in affluence. Or an issue like genetic engineering, cloning, all these things which are part of, yes, science and technology, but ultimately they bring forth questions. What is or who is a human being? Where does it begin? Where does it end? Now, these aren't so much scientific questions, but ultimately science does what it can, but it says, well, who's to answer that question? And that's where, I suppose, the first chapters in the Bible, God made us in his own image. It's not an obsolete myth, but a key to meaning and to hope. These are some of the questions that are in our world today and which won't go away. So what is the church to do in face of these questions and needs? Charles Dickens spoke of his era as the best of times and the worst of times. This seems true of the church too. As we look at the Catholic Church today in our countries, it can be tempting to feel somewhat downhearted. There's a growing concern about the reduction in number of priests and religious. Congregations in some dioceses have been dwindling quite significantly over the past 40 years or so, though I have to say, not the case in my home diocese, largely due to immigrant communities. But if you look at the history of the church, you'll find the church has had to adapt to new situations, new challenges all the time during her long history. Again, T.S. Eliot, the church must be forever building and always decaying, but always being restored. It's with this in mind that I'd like to sketch out some of the priorities for, as it were, a new strategy for the church of the future. And here I just underline the Archbishop's own vision for your own diocese. I do so remembering where we've come from and that we are now in many ways at the center of Christian witness in our countries, while also trying to respond to some of the yearnings present in our society for meaning and for hope. My outline is based on those wonderful words of the Acts of the Apostles about the early Christian community. They remain faithful to the teaching of the apostles, to the brotherhood, to the breaking of bread, and to the prayers. The first and foremost way for renewal and restoration is, of course, through the prayer life of the church, the liturgy. Everyone is called to be holy, and that holiness for us can only come from the gift of life given to us in Jesus Christ. Teach us to pray, said the disciples to Jesus. And the disciples of Jesus in our world continue to make that request our own. Is it not important that our parishes should be schools of prayer in which there are opportunities for people to learn how to pray and to be supported in doing so? Prayer is nourished and sustained through an increased love and appreciation of Holy Scripture, especially the Gospels, where Jesus himself speaks to us. Prayer has to be the ordinary stuff of our Catholic lives in homes, in schools, in parishes. Coupled with prayer is, of course, a deeper understanding and appreciation of the Mass, the Holy Eucharist. Our liturgies should be celebrations that allow people, baptized in the Spirit of God, to rejoice in their faith and to go out strengthened and emboldened to confess it. How often have I seen in parishes the manner of celebration and the participation and reverence of the people has meant that the whole parish is alive with the Spirit of God, and people emerge from the Mass emboldened and encouraged to give witness to Christ in the ordinary events of their life, at home, at work, wherever they are. Another pillar for building up the church today to meet the needs of mission is the development of community life in our parishes, especially through small communities. It seems to me, and I don't think I exaggerate, that most Catholics in the future, apart from the Sunday liturgy, will need to belong to some form of small community. The family, yes, but also any particular parish, diocesan organization, or the small communities or movements that emerge with any particular local church. It's often in these communities that the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Jesus is seen. In my former diocese, in my house, I had quite a large garden. It was really a field. But every year I used to have a day for people with learning difficulties. And maybe about 500 with their families would come. And we'd have a Mass, and I'd confirm them. And then there'd be a tea, and then they would sort of dance afterwards. But I always remember one particular man. He was a bank manager. His wife had died, and he danced with his only daughter, who had these learning difficulties. And you know, when I watched them, and he was a devoted man, I saw in his face something of great suffering and of great love, as if the suffering increased the love he had for his daughter, and the suffering increased the love. And it just reminded me that this was very, very Christian, very Christ-like, very, very wonderful. For my nearly 30 years as a bishop, I've tried to develop groups of people within parishes who come together to listen to the Word of God in Scripture, to reflect on their own lives, and to pray. I often think these small communities are the secret of the future of the Church. It is in this context that Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict encourage new movements, as I do myself. However, I think that new movements will find their rightful place in the Church where the parish community is itself more of a movement, what I call a community of communities. I remember reading nearly 50 years ago now, a book by the Dominican Yves Congar, on lay people in the church, in which he highlights the importance of seeing the church in a new way. This is what he says. Small communities, he said, answer a need to rediscover the church, and in a sense to re-enter and renew her from below. Many of our contemporaries, he says, find that for them the church's machinery, sometimes the very institution, is a barrier obscuring her deep and living mystery. A need is felt beneath the ready-made administrative machinery, the living reality of basic communities. The aspect in which the church herself is at the same time as an objective institution or hierarchical mediation, a community to whose life all its members contribute and which is patterned by a give and take and pooling of resources. I don't want to, in stressing the importance of small communities, I don't want to downplay the importance of the parish. But in my experience, the large parish communities now need the energy and vitality that comes from a variety of smaller communities, both within the parish and across parish boundaries. And I suppose the parish itself must become more flexible. Most parishes go on from time to time and from parish priest to parish priest, and the Archbishop knows the changing of parish priests. There was a parish priest once, got up into his pulpit and said, "Dear people, I have very bad news for you, very sad news for you. The bishop is moving me from the parish." And I know, he said, you'll be very sad, but don't be too upset, because the bishop has said he's going to send a very good priest in my place. Anyway, after the Mass, he went outside, and there were two ladies crying. So he went up to them, and he said, "Ladies, please don't cry. I know you're very sad, but remember, the bishop said he was going to send a very good man in my place." And one of the ladies said, "Oh, yes, Father, but he said that last time." So, well, I'm sure this doesn't happen in this diocese. But while I believe that the presence of small communities in a local church are essential for the vitality of Christian formation and missionary outreach, I would like to register a note of caution, which I take from Pope Paul VI's prophetic instruction, Evangelii Nunciandi. In that document, Pope Paul contrasts these small communities in which people come together in order to deepen one another's love for and existence within the life of the church, with communities that come together in a sense of criticism of the church. The latter stigmatize the church as institutional and set themselves in opposition as kind of charismatic communities free from structures and inspired only by the gospel. Pope Paul lays out some valuable marks or characteristic of authentic small communities, and I think it's worthwhile reminding you of what he says in that document. Small communities, or ecclesial communities, should embrace the church's outward manifestations, namely her hierarchy and her sacramental signs. Then they must come together within the church and cause the church to grow. They are a place of evangelization. They seek nourishment in the Word of God and do not allow themselves to be ensnared by political polarization or fashionable ideologies. They avoid the ever-present temptation of a hypercritical attitude and instead seek authenticity and a spirit of collaboration. They remain firmly attached to the local church and the universal church, avoiding the danger of becoming isolated within themselves or of believing themselves to be the only authentic church of Christ, the only way to Christ. They maintain a sincere communion with the parish priest and the local bishop. They look upon themselves as agents of evangelization, but recognize that the church becomes incarnate in other ways than through themselves. And lastly, they show themselves to be universal in all things and never sectarian. Indeed, if you look at a recent letter from Rome to the Neo-Catechumenal Way, specifically requesting that their members attend Mass at least one Sunday in the month in an ordinary parish, and that they, over a period of 2 years, bring their manner of receiving communion into conformity with the Church's universal norms, then I think what Rome is doing is reflecting some of this consciousness. It is vital as an ecclesial group or small community in the Church to function in a way that reflects the universal character of Catholicism. So let me recap. The first two aspects of renewal in the life of the Church must be the prayer life of the Church and the building of community within the Church. To these two priorities, I would add another one, which is formation in faith. I wonder what we could do in our diocese to equip and educate in a realistic way those devoted men and women who are our strongest collaborators in our parishes. I know that in most parishes, there are parish teams or councils who collaborate with the parish priest in the leadership of the parish. Today, there are many involved in the liturgy as Eucharistic ministers, readers, music ministry, and other ministries who are members of different parish organizations. But it seems to me that there are a large number of people who need to be better informed, educated in their faith. It's very clear from the Catechism of the Catholic Church that there are 4 categories which are offered as a kind of summa, a summary of the Catholic faith. These are what we believe, which is the creed, what we celebrate, which are the sacraments, how we live, the commandments or the beatitudes, and prayer. Now, how do we inform, and with the basis of what the Church teaches, it's to positively our educated Catholic women and men to know their faith in a way that, as it were, their expertise or in so many other facets of their lives in today, but need this extra development of their faith. There are tools to help us teach more effectively in our parishes. And there's also the need to form people in leadership roles. The development of our parishes demand it. I remember many years ago going to a visit to some countries in Africa, and particularly to Kenya. And now in Kenya, I went to one diocese and stayed there for a few days where they didn't have parishes. They had what they call mission stations. And in this huge diocese, which was very flourishing, at the mission station you had a priest with perhaps some religious and the leaders of the catechists. And outside in the villages, there were the leaders, the catechists and others who actually led the local community. Often, although they were associated with the Mass, which they didn't get every Sunday, still the Eucharist was at its heart, but also through baptism and they were formed in faith. Now, I think, without saying you can adapt to what happens in other countries, I do think that many of our parishes in the future will become, as it were, more mission stations, because communion and mission go together. And there's no going back behind the fortress. Some of our people, I think, today are saying, amidst the trials and the challenges of today, we better go back, protect. But I don't think that's what the Vatican Council, I don't think what the last 3 popes, including our present pope, want. They say, no, we live in our world. We're part of our world. We've got to nurture, but also, even if we're swimming against the stream, we have to bring the gospel to the people of our world who look and search, whether they know it or not, for God. Now, I want to turn in this final part of this lecture to the ecclesiology which underpins communion and mission. The mission is to go out to the whole world, as Jesus said, teaching all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and know I am with you always, even to the end of time. This mission is based on what we, as Church, know as communion, or, to use the Greek word, koinonia. It's the very basis of ecclesiology today. I spent many years as co-chairman of something called the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, and all its basis for greater communion with our Anglican brothers and sisters was based on that word, koinonia, communion. In fact, I remember the 2 secretaries, 2 very good ladies, the one Anglican, one Catholic, they didn't know anything very much, I think, about theology, nor about the word koinonia, and one sent a Christmas card to the other, Happy Christmas and koinonia to you, he said. But that, in fact, the emphasis on communion, on unity, I hope helps us move beyond any power politics that may emerge between the priesthood of the baptized and the ministerial priesthood. When we begin to look at communion and mission and to understand authentic collaboration. I remember once in the life of the late Cardinal Winning of Glasgow, who was a very good friend of mine, he said, "We're all equal before we begin to be different." And perhaps you know what he meant. He was a very good friend of mine. He loved telling the story of when Pope John Paul came to Britain, and in particular to Scotland. And you must know, of course, that in Scotland they still look to 300 years ago when Bonnie Prince Charlie, one of the Stuarts, who lost the final battle and had to go over the sea to France. And so they coined the song, "Will Ye Nae Come Back Again?" Anyway, when Pope John Paul was leaving the airport, the vast crowd there, they started singing, "Will Ye Nae Come Back Again?" So Pope John Paul turned to Cardinal Winning and said, "What's that song they're singing? Will ye nae come back again?" And so Archbishop Winning said, "Well, Holy Father, that song is the song we Scots sing, hoping that Bonnie Prince Charlie will come back again." And the Pope said, "Oh, I met him last week," he said. So I don't think he quite cottoned on, or maybe he did. But in noting the link between communion and mission in this way, we see the intrinsic relation and quality of our identity as Christians, indeed as human beings. We exist and we understand ourselves in connection to others. This is true in the church as well as in human society generally. And I've found a helpful way of understanding this is through the Marian and the Petrine principles of the church, and how these identify how each of us lives out the universal call to holiness and to participation in the life of the Trinity. I particularly reflect here the insights of a great theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, who both Pope John Paul and Pope Benedict regard very, very highly. If we think about the life of Jesus, we know that he gathered round him a group of human individuals: Mary, Peter, the apostles, Lazarus, and so on. Historically, those whom Jesus gathered round him formed a kind of human constellation, making up the beginnings of the church. But this gathering of individuals round Jesus is not limited to the beginnings of the church. We believe that the risen Christ is present throughout history. So those who gathered round Jesus in the gospel as the human constellation of the church continue to exist in some form now within the church. Those chosen by the Lord represent a principle or fundamental dimension of church life, which continue in some way the foundational experiences of faith of the people gathered round Jesus during his earthly life. The most important of these was, first of all, of course, Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the other was Peter, the head of the apostles. Reflecting on this, I think, can help us to understand how collaboration is to function within the church, and in particular, how any tension that may exist between the ordained and the lay people. The pastoral office given to Peter refers to the hierarchical and institutional dimension of the church. This is what I would call the Petrine principle. Peter receives from Jesus entrustment with the keys of the kingdom. "You are Peter, on this rock I will build my church." So this dimension of church life points us to the exercise of apostolic office and guarantees in the church what we might call objective holiness. Through apostolic office, through the ministry entrusted to Peter and the apostles, the Holy Spirit, divine love, comes to all God's people, mediated and channeled in word, authority and teaching and sacrament. It means that when the sacraments are celebrated, when the word is preached by an ordained minister, we can know that God is communicating his life to his people. The transmission of that life of God doesn't depend on the holiness of the individual priest or bishop, but is guaranteed by Christ in what he has handed on to Peter and the apostles and those who participate in that ministry. But alongside this, the Marian dimension manifests the response of human love to divine love. Mary's perfect yes of love to God meant that the mystery of Trinitarian life entered into history. Through the womb of Mary, Christ became man, and the unique reality of the church as the body of Christ spread throughout space and time. At the foot of the cross, Mary became the personal center of the church and mother of all the future disciples of Jesus. This role of Mary continues in the church as the principle of personal holiness in the heart of each believer, in the heart of each one of us. For this reason, Mary is the first of the disciples of Jesus, not merely because she is the first to wholly respond to the gift of Christ, but it is also because under her, each of us is tutored in our discipleship of Christ. The Marian principle refers to the personal response of each believer to the message of Jesus Christ. Every year, I go on pilgrimage with my diocese to Lourdes. It's always a marvelous experience. And one of my priests told me one year of the response of a group that he was on pilgrimage with. A young woman, a young mother had come with him, and there was among them, this young mother was only about 19 years old, and they took their first trip to the site of the apparitions where Bernadette first saw Our Lady. They stood on the other side of the river opposite the grotto, and if you've ever been there, perhaps you've seen pictures of it. There's the site of the apparitions, which looks like a cave, and the statue of Mary is in it. And above the grotto is the towering Gothic-like basilica, the church that reaches up to the sky, and built as a result of Mary's request. So catching her glimpse of this for the first time, the young mother sighed, "How beautiful. Look, Mary is holding up the church." And I think this is what is meant by the Marian principle or dimension. The holiness born in the life of Mary is mirrored in the personal wholeness of the individual believers throughout time and space. So I hope you begin to see where I'm going with this. I want to say that the apostolic office, that particular manifestation of Petrine, objective holiness, word, sacrament, teaching authority, finds its meaning and its purpose in the subjective and personal holiness of Mary as lived by all of us, the ordinary believers. Both the Petrine and the Marian are essential dimensions of the life of the church and are ordered one to another. They indicate how we each live out our communion in the church and our participation in the mission of Christ to the world. Ministerial priesthood cannot make sense without a baptized people whom it can serve. Similarly, the baptized need the ministerial priesthood if they are to fully manifest their high calling. One cannot exist without the other. And again, you'll find this in parish life. And it helps us to move on from the rather barren debates about who exercises power in church life, or harping back to a form of ministry that probably never existed in the first place. So when we talk about lay people finding their rightful place, I don't think it's so much about lay people doing jobs that the ordained shouldn't be doing anyway. I think it's really an invitation to try to discover a path of holiness in the life of each person, and for the ordained ministry to try and serve that and to call it forth. And some years ago, there was a document from the Vatican on vocations, and it spoke of the task of helping every baptized person to discover the dream found in God's heart, because the person is found in the heart of God. I like that very much, because we're all concerned with individual dreams, and they're coming to be the person that God has called them to be, where they are, who they are. And so I'd like to finish with telling you a story about a very favorite pope of mine. Well, all popes are I suppose, favorites, but this is a story about Pope John the 23rd, who, as you know, became Pope very late in life and called the Vatican Council. But anyway, at the age of 80, they gave him a birthday party in the Vatican, and they were all there, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, monsignori. But in their midst was a little group that came from his home village of Sotto il Monte in the north of Italy. And they were there, about 10 or 12 of them, looking rather uncomfortable, with their Sunday best clothes on, the peasant people, rather overawed by all the grandees who were around. But Pope John came in And he said, before I talk to you, cardinals and bishops, I want to talk to this group who've come a long way to wish me a happy birthday. So he went over with them and said, thank you very much, my dear friends, for coming from my home village. He said, if things were different, I would like to have taken you out to a ristorante, and we'd have some pasta and some vino, and we'd talk about old times and have a party. But he said, we can't always do what we want to do. He said, when I left Sotil Monte, I went into the seminary to train for the priesthood. And the seminary was very cold, the food was terrible. And every now and again, I'd say to myself, his name was Angelo Roncalli. He'd say, Angelo, this is no place for you. But then I thought, well, God has called me here, I must trust him. So I stayed, and I was ordained a priest. And then, very shortly afterwards, I was made the bishop's secretary. And I used to drive the car, carry the bags, do this and do that. I'm sorry, Father Mark. And every now and again, I'd say to myself, Angelo, this is no place for you. He said, but then I joined the Vatican diplomatic service, and I was sent all over the world. But then I was in Turkey for 10 years and in Bulgaria. And I used to get messages from the Secretariat of State doing this and do that and say this. And it was very boring, he said. And how often did I say to myself, Angelo, this is no place for you. But then he said, at last, I was very happy. I was made Archbishop, Patriarch of Venice. And I said, thank you, Lord, because I'll now spend the rest of my days as the shepherd, the pastor of my people, which I've always wanted. So I went there. But then after a few years, he said, my predecessor, Pius XII, died. And I, at the age of 77, I went down for the conclave. And as I went into the conclave, I said to myself, Angelo, they wouldn't, would they? he said, but they did, he said. And here I am, surrounded by cardinals and bishops and monsignori, and I'd much prefer be with you, my dear friends from my home village, and have a party just by ourselves. But he said, we can't always do what we want to do. He said, and God has called each one of you where you are. And he's called me where I am. And we must trust him. And that story tells me, as I hope it tells you, that each of us, it doesn't matter who you are or where you are in a sense, but that God has a purpose, sometimes beyond all our expectations, all our understandings, and that where we are and who we are and the circumstances which we live, this is where he wants us to be, and this is where our communion and our mission are to take place. And so for that, I think we should give thanks to God and say, let's go and trust in him. Thank you.
I sort of think that the Second Vatican Council was a rebirthing or a renewal of the Church. And with that in mind, 30-odd years down the track, we are still in our infancy or in a very a young time of this rebirth. And because we're toddlers, so to speak, we're always at each other's throats. We never seem to... we can't really come to this communion and mission because we argue all the time. And I've come across that recently in some reading I've been doing. And we're like the children in the playground. We get out there, we fight, we bash each other about. We then send little notes to Daddy over in Rome when we don't agree with what the other one is saying. So I think we have a long way to go before we can really come to terms with what's happening in the church. It might be 100 years down the track before our dream comes alive. That's just a statement, not a question.
Well, let me say two things. First of all, the great councils in the church, and not every council has been a very significant council, but great councils of the church have always resulted in a certain matter, a sort of certain upheaval afterwards, a certain tensions in the church as a result of the lines in which the council took. It happened in the early church with some of those great councils, certainly happened in the Council of Trent, and has happened in the Second Vatican Council. That here the indications that were given in those great council documents, particularly on the church and on the on Revelation, and then on the church and the modern world, and so on, and ecumenism, and especially one might say that rather small document on the dialogue with other faiths and other. Now, all these give indications, which we're coping with at the moment, and the strains that are there within the church are what I would call a sign, in my view, not to be worried too much about it, because it's a sign that the council has had an effect. And 40 years afterwards, we're living with it now in a very real and constructive way, much more so than immediately following the council. And I think there was a kind of superficial reaction. The other point, which is rather a wider one, is that a great theologian, Karl Rahner, said that there were three periods in the church. The first period was the period, as it were, of the diaspora of the Christian community, the Jewish in the Jewish diaspora, up to the year about 100, the beginnings of the church, and then the next era goes up till about nearly the present time, namely the development of the Greco-Roman Empire and the church, especially in Europe, and then going out to the other nations and other continents from Europe, a sort of missionary church in that sense. Now he says, Rahner, that we're in a third age of the church, where the church has to live with other churches, has to live with other faith communities. It's a world church. And therefore, we have to, as it were, cope with this now, the situation of the Catholic Church, not only with our fellow Christians, but also with other faiths. And how do we deal with this? It's a new challenge for the church. But I don't think we should be frightened about it. I think we've got the resources and the grace and the promises with which to deal with it. But thank you for raising a very important point.
Your Grace, with the influx of Muslim peoples into London and various areas in England, has this caused any problems with the local people, the local culture, communities, Catholic schools, or anything like that?
I think that the large number of Muslim people in Britain now, they're 1.5 million, I think, in the light of the recent bombing, certainly has caused a great deal of worry and concern amongst most people in Britain, particularly, I might say, with the bombings last year, and that these were performed by young men who were born and brought up in England. They weren't people who'd come in from abroad. So there is certainly a great deal of tension, I suppose, particularly in my own city of London. However, I think I ought to say that there's such a thing as militant Islam and moderate Islam. And most of the Muslims that I meet and in contact with are moderate and want to become more integrated into British society. In fact, let me finish, please. The Muslim leader in London came to see me with some of his colleagues to ask me how, in the light of the Catholic community in Britain, who had been, as I've said, on the periphery and yet now are more integrated into social, how they could do it. In other words, how moderate Muslims can actually become part of the society in Britain. And so I mentioned things like there's a long road, and education, and civic values, and also dialogue, not conversion. The whole point about dialogue is, yes, to give witness to what we believe strongly, but at the same time to respect people of other faiths, and how that results is up to the Lord. I think the last thing I would say about the Muslims and Islam is that it is a very crucial time, not just in Britain, but also all over Europe. There are 4 million in France, very, very many in Spain, and I think that the way we react to and as it were, look at the influx of Muslim people is something for the Catholic community particularly to look at. And can we give an example of good dialogue with Muslims in terms of, as I say, cooperation on things we do agree with, and there are many, in terms of peace, in terms of family, other values. And I think we can do that in a respectful dialogue, not denying any of the uniqueness that we possess in the Catholic Church, but at the same time realizing that we live in this new world where we do have to cooperate, but also dialogue. And what does that mean? Now, I think dialogue means a respect, a listening to one another, and leaving the question of the influence on one another, yes, to God. It's a very big question, and I think you'll find in the years to come that this will be much more dominant here in your own country, where I understand, according to the latest census, there's something like 350,000 now Muslim people in Australia. It's a very big question, but thank you for raising it.
Your Eminence, my question's about, it's focused towards young people, but I suppose it's also comes out of a sense of broader church as well. In Australia, we come out of a predominantly secularised society, but whenever you walk into a bookshop, one of the biggest sections will be the New Age spirituality and those sort of things. And there's a theologian who works out of one of the big Melbourne universities, David Tacey, who speaks about young people and their want to connect, but not necessarily with organised religion or institutionalised church, that sort of thing. What would you say would be 2 or 3 key messages that we need to get out to young people or people in general as to why church should be important for them?
One of the lectures I've given on this visit to Australia has been entitled Belief Without Belonging. And I think a lot of young people pick and mix in various, a little bit of New Age here, a little bit of Buddhism there, a little bit of Christianity there, I exaggerate. And what I think is that the Catholic Church must reach deep down to the richness of its traditions and realize that it can offer young people in terms of silence, in terms of contemplation, in terms of a way of life that brings happiness and fulfillment and truth, and for young people. Now, and that's easier said than done, I realize, but I do think that my experience of young people is that we do have to listen to them, but also walk with them. And I have found, for instance, that pilgrimages, of course I'm delighted that you're going to have the World Youth Day here in 2 years' time, but also we ought to be doing that in our home diocese, of getting young people together, particularly late teens, university, post-university, sometimes young people, through prayer, through talking together, through listening to the gospel, through caring sometimes for those in need, they find they've got a new lung. I find every year I bring 200 or so young people to Lourdes, and many of them go back conscious that they've seen a side of Christianity and their faith that they never realized was there. And so it's that somehow bringing them into the mystery of Christ and the church. And I accept that in our consumer society, the voice is rather more difficult to be heard. And that's why they need a little bit of awareness. They need a little bit of silence. They need a little bit of help in that. And that, I think, is a challenge for the local church. Because otherwise, young people, and one can understand it, and they are very generous, and they are very open, but sometimes they're open to values that actually, I think, can diminish, sometimes obliterate the other voices of faith and of purpose and of meaning that we have in the church. I have found, for instance, certainly in London, but I'm sure it's true here too in your own archdiocese here, that there are quite a significant number of young people, many of them highly educated in their 20s and who have got jobs in the city, but find that they want to find this kind of silence, this kind of formation, this kind of time to realize how do they live their lives as a young person with the faith that they have in the kind of society in which they have to live. A society, as I say, of consumerism, of money, and all the things you know so well. How do you swim against the stream? But you know, swimming against the stream is our natural habitat. It's not all of you who fish, you know, trout only always swim against the stream. And it seems to me that as Catholic Christians, as disciples of Jesus, that's how we've got to live, much more. And I think people now, and young people particularly, are not going to be Christian, are not going to be disciples of Jesus, unless somehow they've been able personally to respond to, in other words, it doesn't always just come because they're in a Christian family. Obviously that helps, but at a certain point, a decision has to be made. And I find that many young people do make that and enter into, as it were, a new way of life, a new understanding of what life is and the position and the significance of Christ within that life. But I think that in all our dioceses, this is a huge challenge. Where are our young people? How do we reach them? But I think they can be touched where they itch. And I think it's the task of everyone, not just priests and bishops, but lay leadership too, and indeed young leadership among young people to bring them on that path.
Cardinal, knowing your influence in the ecumenism scene, we as Catholics, how far are we really away from intercommunion with the mainstream churches? And I guess we here in our archdiocese rely very much on the hierarchy to set the scene so that permission is given or whatever. Just wanting to know at what stage or what influence?
Well, your Archbishop is very much involved in the ecumenical scene, as I am myself. I certainly think that, particularly with our friends of the Anglican Communion, that we've reached a certain, what I would call a plateau. When I was co-chairman of this Anglican Roman Catholic Commission, appointed in 1982, I think there was a hope then that within 10, 15 years, we would recognize each other's ministries and be able to have reciprocal communion. Now, for various reasons, not only questions regarding the ordination of women to the priesthood and the episcopate, but other reasons as well regarding authority, this has not been possible. And we seem now to have reached a kind of plateau where there are many things with our Anglican friends which we do profoundly agree. And I think that the main discussions or divergencies that happened at the time of the Reformation are now kind of solved, matters of justification and so on. So what do I think? First of all, I think, as I often say, that ecumenism is a road with no exit. There's no going back, and thank God for that. Secondly, that when you think of what it was like 40, 50 years ago, we, with our Anglican and Free Church friends, we've come in a huge way together. And there are many things in our society where Anglicans and Catholics and other Christians as well can and do cooperate, and very significantly so. This year, I was telling the Archbishop, we're having a meeting of all our English Catholic bishops in England and Wales with the Anglican bishops to discuss together what can we do. If we cannot have full intercommunion, what can we do in terms of our partial communion together, but it's real, and also with mission, just the very points. So I think we've got to realize, be hopeful about the future. You know, the enemies of ecumenism are suspicion, inertia, and impatience. We were very suspicious of each other. That's I think, is gone or going. We were, I think, inertia. You know, ecumenism happens where it happens. And if it's not happening in your parish, the Holy Spirit can't work, if to put it badly. So I think where Christians do meet together, where they do pray together, where they do try to give witness together, then the Holy Spirit actually operates. And then I think impatience. We all want things to happen tomorrow. Well, we've got to be patient and realize that this will work in the Lord's time, but be faithful to what we hold and believe, but at the same time open in every way that we can to following that path, which, as I say, must necessarily, in the will of Christ, continue.
Cardinal, could you give us a holy thought as to how the Trinity fits into our part in the Church at the present moment?
I think this is a very good question to end on. Well, I think that one of the wonderful things that has happened, that now, I think, in our liturgy, in our prayer, Catholic people or Christian people are very much aware that they pray through and in and with Jesus to the Father by the grace of the Holy Spirit. And in a way, I think that perhaps 50 years ago it wasn't so. You prayed to Jesus, if you like. Now I think that the mystery of the Incarnation, the mystery of the Trinity, you know the three mysteries, great mysteries of the Church are the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the Redemption. And the Trinity, which reveals to us that something that's so profound and so extraordinary, if you like, more or less, nearly beyond our comprehension, that our God is not a lonely God, and that in God, the God who loves us and who forgives us, who's with us, is a God who is three. Father, his love for the Son, the love for the Father, so complete that it is in fact the Holy Spirit. And it's this kind of spirituality whereby our understanding of our Christian faith, because of what Jesus reveals to us, yes, the mystery of God. God as Father, God as Son, God as Holy Spirit. And I find in my own prayer life that I find that my reflections are, yes, focused on Jesus, but always, as it were, away to the Father. Jesus, as always, is giving me the Holy Spirit. And so I think that mystery of the Trinity, which should be preached much more in our churches, to give people at least some kind of understanding of what is perhaps the greatest mystery revealed by Christ, namely the mystery of God himself. Thank you.
Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor is the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster in London. In 2006, he came to Australia as a special guest of the Aquinas Academy. Whilst here, he gave 3 public lectures. This is the second of those lectures, given in Melbourne on August the 31st. It is entitled, Selling Everything for the Sake of the Kingdom.
Your Eminence, Your Grace, Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, this is quite an occasion, my goodness me. You know, I came to Australia once before and arrived in Sydney and stayed at the seminary, but I have a cousin called Father Jerry Murphy O'Connor, who is a scripture scholar, and he had just come before me giving on a lecture tour. I didn't meet him, but when I arrived at the seminary, he left a note on my desk saying, welcome to Australia. The name is good, don't blow it. So I hope I don't blow it this evening with so many of you here, and there's still people coming in. So with so many, you know the story of the bishop who went to a parish and there were very few people there, and he was a bit angry, and he said to the parish priest, "Didn't you tell them that the bishop was coming?" And the parish priest said, "No, my lord, but the news must have leaked out somehow." So whatever news is leaked out, it certainly leaked out here. Now, some years ago, I was invited to take part in a program in England called Desert Island Discs. It's a program in which a person interviewed has to choose 8 records and give the reason why he's chosen them. And most of the records I chose were classical, though I remember one record that used to be very well known. It was Yesterday by the Beatles. Do you remember it? If I had my guitar, I'd sing it to you. But I chose this because it reminded me of a time when I was a young priest. Very exciting times with young people. But that yesterday for me is nearly 50 years old. And the young people I was with then have grown older like me. We belong to a new age and a new millennium. They're fascinating and perhaps also bewildering times. We are living through unexpected cultural upheavals. It is high season for prophets, poets, cults, doom merchants, and futurologists of all kinds. Recently, I read somewhere that everything is possible, nothing is certain. Even Christian authors are talking about the present time as one of transition, a turning point, a time of crisis. As you know, when we talk of crisis in Christian terms, we understand that in the biblical way, as a time of decision, an opportunity, as well as an experience of upheaval. So I want, during this lecture, to look and try to discern afresh the signs of our times, especially as experienced by young people in this particular moment of decision. I'm aware that there are members of other faiths and traditions here, and so, as you'll understand, I'm speaking of my own particular experience in the Catholic Church. Pope John Paul was inspired to begin his apostolic letter, Novo Millennio in Eonte, at the start of a new millennium, with Christ's invitation to Simon, launch out into the deep. There is a sense, 40 years or so from the beginning of the Second Vatican Council, that the waters around us are very deep, and on the whole choppy and hard to navigate. We have in common with most people a sense of foreboding for our young people. There seem to be fewer young women and men who want to live the apostolic life. In many of our countries, there are fewer young people who attend Sunday Mass. There are some young people who seem to have a certain sense of disillusionment with the church. So I think there's a time for very acute listening, and not least to our young people. Young people are more in touch with the changing temper of our times than we are. They have a crucial part to play in the dialogue which takes place between the church and the modern world. They are part of the preamble to discovering new and meaningful ways to evangelize, to spread the good news of the gospel. So I want to speak first of all about the world in which we live. I don't speak from a historical or specifically cultural perspective, but from a contemporary one. As a pastor, as a shepherd, who's trying to understand a little the world in which our young are formed and mature in. What is this modern or postmodern world? What is it like to be a young person living as part of this society? And following that, I want to look at ways in which our Christian, our Catholic faith can challenge and captivate young people so that they in turn become evangelizers for our society today. Modern and postmodern are terms that are in no way clear and cannot even be clearly told apart. One might say that modern societies of the West, and I include Australia in this, which emerged in the 19th century, had a very clear structure. People knew their places within them. Moral and social values had a fairly clear consensus that arose for the most part out of the great Judeo-Christian story and its implication for purpose and meaning. But in the postmodern era, almost everything is mixed together, and the relatively clear outlines of society become confused. The institutions which only a generation ago inspired almost unquestioning trust are now perhaps properly the subject of scrutiny and suspicion. Look at any contemporary institution, and you will see this is so. To the church, to the law, to academic institutions, and in our own country, to royalty. I was very amused the other day, someone talking about Queen Elizabeth and of how she'd been at lunch in the north of England, which have a very particular accent, with the mayor of this particular town, and halfway through the lunch the mayor said to the Queen, Your Majesty, I'm not sure what I should call you. And the Queen said, well, you've been calling me love for the last half hour. So you don't know what's going to come. Parliamentary democracy, which had been regarded as a serious progressive model for the expression of political views and the making of laws, is now seen as tainted by corruption, self-interest, and the politics of money. And then science, which was once seen as driven solely by the disinterested search for an understanding of the natural world that could be harnessed for the common good, is increasingly perceived as driven by business for the discovery and development of new and hugely profitable technologies. So economic interests, technological progress, new markets are destroying the traditional milieu, which includes the church, religion, and the family. Old certainties are questioned and frequently undermined by strident apologists of the postmodern. Pilate unconsciously revealed himself to be the first postmodern thinker with his famous truth. What is truth? Truth in this postmodern milieu is no longer received, need not necessarily be proved objectively, because there's no such thing as objective. Your truth is yours, mine is mine. You are the product of your language and culture. I am the product of mine. I remember my predecessor, Cardinal Basil Hume, having a conversation with a young person. The Cardinal expressed his traditional view about aspects of morality, and the young person said, "Well, that's your view, isn't it?" That's the response of a postmodern young person. Postmodernism, then, is an alteration in the fabric of our culture, even if for some the process of alteration is only just beginning. We're talking about a culture increasingly dominated by choice, personal preference, and immediacy. The culture is significantly influenced by market forces and driven by business interests. Both the market and the consumer are subject to manipulation. Fashion, the media, advertising, political correctness all play their part. I suppose the truth is that we do not see ourselves, and young people do not see themselves in the same way anymore. While their own life is still formed and managed on the basis of cultural and religious values, these no longer follow standardized or existing models. And indeed, it's done à la carte, in a selective and individualistic way. A bit of Buddhism, a bit of New Age, chapter from the New Testament, course in Oriental meditation, a pick and choose. I once went into a men's shop to look at men's toiletries. I do assure you, all I wanted was toothpaste and some shampoo. But I was amazed by the titles of these toiletries and the language that was used. You find such products, at least in England, as transcendence, vision, grace, salvation. Now, these are all religious words, but how extraordinary that society would have taken the words of religion, which lead to an inner life and an afterlife, and then made them a philosophy to achieve beauty and transcendence in this life. It tells us something about the end of modernity, that is the postmodern, that it is again enabling the unearthing of something of the power of the religious imagination. And so I suppose there's a bit of hope in that, but of that a little later. So it seems to me that the problem of postmodern times is not the absence of religion, but the mixing of different elements from various religious traditions and the rapid consumption of those elements, almost like fast food. In such a context, our church, with her choices of how to direct one's life, seems no longer to have a monopoly. But I want to say that I don't see this postmodern period as totally negative, not in any way. And in some manner, it's liberating us. And that's why I think it needs a new sensitivity and a new approach to evangelization. So what is it like to be a young person today? I mean, there are many young people here, so I'm not sure I can give any kind of full answer. The glib answer is pretty good. Standards of education and affluence, especially for the middle classes, are rising. The breakdown of the old consensus means that for those so inclined, these can be very exciting times intellectually. It seems to me there's no limit to the avenues to be explored. For those with leisure and money, new ways to stretch your horizons are being invented all the time. Global travel, adventure tourism, bungee jumping, snowboarding, and so on. More choice, more opportunity. and also easier access to the affluence which opens doors. The accident of birth is very slowly becoming less of a determining factor when it comes to accessing the highest levels of education or the lower reaches of the employment market, or better jobs for the ambitious and clever. But the picture and the prospects are not uniformly positive for young people across Europe, or I suspect in Australia. There is still a yawning social divide between the rich and the poor in all our countries. Greater affluence has a tendency to bring in its wake a generalized aspiration for more and better. Fueled by a pervasive "you can have it if you want it" advertising culture, aimed deliberately at the youngest consumers and fed by the natural urge to want more than you have, and at least as much as him or her. Jealousy, violence, or robbery are sometimes a means to short-circuit the poverty gap that is on the increase. But it is also true that in our postmodern world we have witnessed the very serious breakdown in the fundamental building blocks of our society. Awesome numbers of marital separations are now very common. In Britain, I think it's about 45% of today's marriages end in divorce. This means that a quarter of our children are raised by single parents or unmarried couples, or even by the same-sex couples through adoption. Our communities are under threat of disintegration. And all of this leads to a kind of individualization of society, of choices that are to be made. Means that the individual has a more open attitude towards traditional ties like family, religion, and feels obliged, for it's not always a free choice, to move house, change lifestyle, conditioned by labour market or other social processes. The individual does not see himself only as subject to outside pressures, but thanks to the modern experience of freedom and a history of freedom, recognizes that he or she can write their own biography, live their own lifestyle free from outside influences. Traditional values and lifestyles have not necessarily become devalued, but they have lost their exclusivity. Everything that is here and now that brings instant entertainment and promises a feel-good factor is permitted and considered a good thing. But the greatest threat that arises from individualism is that ultimately it threatens social cohesion, the family, and the community. Ultimately, it threatens one of the most vital and perhaps fragile support systems we humans have ever devised, the basic community. At its best, community is the place of most profound human flourishing. Yes, the family, but also it's inspired Christians from St. Benedict to Jean Vanier, Frère Roger, Mother Teresa, Francis of Assisi, and countless others. Our sense of communion, of community, is the most fundamental part of our being human. It was Sartre who said, hell is other people, but of course he was wrong. To be human means to be in relationship. And so the concentration on the individual in contemporary society has brought in its wake greater personal isolation and loneliness. One need only look at the high incidence of suicide among many young adult men. So there's a sense of homelessness, a diminished sense of community and belonging, which is high on the lost side of the postmodern balance sheet. There is an opportunity for young people to be exploited, and in a pick-and-mix lifestyle, disillusion commonly sets in. They sense what is really on offer, certainly in the consumer market, but also on the à la carte liberal approach to morals and sexuality, the freedom to surf an endless, illusory wave of pseudo-choice. The real questions underneath remain unanswered. If people were to ask you, give me a definition of the postmodern or postmodernity, I think I would say postmodernity arises from the vacuum created by the failure of many of the values of modernity, of modern life, to satisfy the deepest yearnings of the human heart. So I see the situation regarding young people as an extraordinary invitation for us to launch out into the deep and honestly, thoughtfully, to understand the ways and the manner in which young people are evangelized in our society and evangelize us, especially those of us who are bishops, priests, leaders belonging to an older generation. So now I want to indicate ways in which in our Catholic faith we can reach out to young people and enrich them and be enriched by them. And I was wondering really what to choose, always difficult. I was once in Ireland with a priest friend, and we came to a small town and we wanted lunch, and in this small town there was in the middle of the square there was a hotel each side of the square, and there was a man leaning against the wall, and I went to him and I said, "Excuse me, we're on visitors and we'd like lunch, and there are 2 hotels, would you like to recommend one?" And he looked at me, took the pipe out of his mouth and said, "Well, sir, it's like this, if you chose the one, you wish you'd chosen the other." which was very Irish and not much help. But you see, I believe that our community our young people are a community who are searching, and that search is a challenge to the whole church to journey with them in their seeking. They are engaged in the search in 3 ways. First, they are seeking anew the living God, but don't know always where to go. Secondly, they are seeking to belong, seeking community. And thirdly, I believe our young people are seeking ways of helping the world, especially the poor, and how we reach out to those in most need. There's a Canadian author called Douglas Coupland who wrote a novel called Life After God. It's an attempt to explore the tension and the richness at the heart of postmodern society. And this is what he says in this passage. "Now, here is my secret. I tell it to you with an openness of heart that I doubt I shall ever achieve again. So I pray that you are in a quiet room as you hear these words. My secret is that I need God, that I am sick and can no longer make it alone. I need God to help me give because I no longer seem to be capable of giving, to help me to be kind as I no longer seem capable of kindness, to help me love as I seem beyond being able to love." His is this still small voice speaking out of a desolation of many people in our society today. It's as though people, especially many young people, are dressed up complete with 1,001 possibilities but nowhere to go. And it's out of this vacuum, sometimes desolation, that they reach out to God. And I suspect that our postmodern society, for many, many people, is leading them back to God. I'd say that it's very important for our Christian community, for the church, to be full of people who are hopeful, but particularly that we're people who are prayerful, keep watch. Throughout the Bible, prayer is described as keeping watch, paying attention for the return of the Lord. The Psalms are books of lamentations, of expectation, of justice, of protection of the pious, of the forgiveness of the sinner, and patience in time of trial. Prayer is always patiently suspending oneself between the past and the future. To pray is to consult one's memory, to feed it. Prayer is also to look forward with a burning heart to the days to come, to the turn of the Lord. Maranatha, come, Lord Jesus, raising up of the mind and heart to God. You may know the story of the boy who was in an orphanage. It was very strict. Just outside the orphanage there was a lake, and the boy had been told that when the sun came out, the lake was an amazing sight. So one night he got up at 1 o'clock in the morning, took off his shoes, crept along the corridor, down the stairs, and climbed over the wall and sat by the lake and waited. The sun came up, and suddenly the lake was transformed with orange, green, yellow, gold. It was an extraordinary sight, and he was entranced. So entranced that he stayed too long. He got up and went back and began to climb the wall. But then he got down, he looked at the lake again and looked up at the sky and said, I know I'll be punished, but I have learned something. The God of the lake is much, much greater than the God of the orphanage. The God we believe in is always greater than any of our attempts to define or summarize. It is the personal witness of ordinary disciples to the encounter with God in Jesus, which is so important. I remember a mother speaking to me once about the fact that some of her children were no longer practicing their faith and that she had no more ways of handing on to them her faith. And she prayed. And she asked me, was there anything more she could do? I said, perhaps the best thing you can do to hand on to your children is your happiness and joy at being a disciple of Jesus, following his way. There's a nice story that at the end of his life, St. Francis of Assisi was challenged by a peasant who was concerned about the need to practice. And Francis was traveling with his companions towards the mountain retreat of La Verne, which had been given to the friars by a rich man. It was a place of deep significance for Francis, because it was here that he'd received the marks of the 5 wounds of Christ, imprinted in his hands, his feet, and his side. Francis was only in his 40s, but he'd become so weak, the brothers asked an elderly peasant if he would lend his donkey for Francis to ride. With great care, the good man saddled a donkey, led it to Francis, helped him into the saddle, and walked beside him. And as they were going along, the peasant asked Francis, "Are you Brother Francis of Assisi?" Francis replied that he was. "Well then," said the peasant, "try to be as good as everybody thinks you are, because many people have great faith in you. So I urge you, never let there be anything in you different from what they expect of you." When Francis heard these words, he got off the donkey, threw himself on his knees, and thanked the peasant for having admonished him so charitably. I love that story because it shows that even the greatest saints have to remember that their gifts are from God and that all of us have to be humble and subject to challenge and correction. It's the personal witness of having encountered Jesus Christ which most of all will help young people search for God. They will see that there is the source of that happiness, of that hope, of that needing, which is God. The God who is the Father of Jesus Christ, who in Jesus reveals the mystery, the beauty, and the love and forgiveness of God for everyone. The second aspect of evangelization, of young people particularly, is the need to rediscover a crucial instrument of evangelization, which is community. As I mentioned earlier, there's a sense in which community is threatened by our society today. There is an excessive emphasis on individuality and self-expression, which can diminish respect for the idea of community, for the common good. So can the breakdown of marriage increase social mobility and so on? We have to discover our faith in the humanizing experience of community and our respect for the community as a place of healing. Take, for example, communities like L'Arche, which look after with people with learning difficulties. Young people can experience enormous liberation from living alongside people with obvious disabilities, because it allows them to discover their own and to be freed of the pressure to appear perfect and unwounded. And particularly in the context of tonight's meeting, it seems to me important to stress the importance of belonging to one human family. We've just opened the Asian Pacific at the Center for Interreligious Dialogue. I'm conscious of the vitally healing power of dialogue, both within community and across different religious traditions, which highlight this. Particularly the 3 great monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and other faith communities. The foundation of our dialogue is the common ancestry in a single God and the rejection by Abraham of idols. This opens the possibility, indeed the obligation, of a bond between human beings, whatever their beliefs. I was glad to be present at a meeting of world religious leaders last year in Lyon, run by a society called San Egidio. This has met each year since the first meeting of world religions called by Pope John Paul in 1986. These meetings have developed what many people now call a spiritual humanism of peace. which stresses that we're all divinely created human beings, sons and daughters of a common Father. We need to keep returning to this common ancestry. More religion of the true sort means human beings becoming closer to God and therefore to each other. British Christians have a long-standing and fruitful dialogue with Judaism. In the light of present global tensions, I want to mention in particular here the place of Christian-Muslim dialogue, which I think is so important in the present climate in which we live. Perhaps the most remarkable event in the modern history of Catholic-Muslim relations was when Pope John Paul II visited Morocco after an invitation from King Hassan II. This was in 1985. The Pope addressed a crowd of 60,000 young Muslims in a sports stadium, which was a truly remarkable moment. We believe in the same God, Pope John Paul told them, the one God, the living God, the God who creates the world and brings the world to perfection. The challenge in our theological dialogue is to be able to conduct this dialogue without, of course, diminishing what are in our faith's exclusive claims. We can stress what we hold in common as children of Abraham and continue to remind ourselves of this. Nevertheless, the delicate task of our contemporary societies is to forge this dialogue and cooperation, to overcome ignorance and to learn mutual respect. All interreligious cooperation has as its important focus the challenge of upholding the principle of religious freedom. If we do not enjoy the freedom to practice our religion openly and without fear, then we cannot be honest. A defensive mentality is created in which people treat their different religions as clubs, the only places where they can relax and be themselves. Dialogue assumes the freedom to witness. And I might say it's essential that Muslims can freely worship, as they do here in Melbourne and Sydney, just as it's also essential that Christians should be able to freely worship in Riyadh or Kabul. It's a vital principle of sacred hospitality and vital for the relationship between Christians and Jews, where Christians are being denied their rights or vice versa, or subject to Sharia law. It's not a matter on which Muslims in Britain or in Australia can remain silent. Where religious rights of minorities are disrespected in the name of Islam, the face of Islam may be tarnished elsewhere in the world. Sacred hospitality demands that we speak up for each other, and it impels our communities to take common action together, especially in response to social issues or in response to disasters and emergencies. One of my happier moments during this last year was to go to Sri Lanka on the very anniversary of the terrible tsunami and its effects there. I went to commemorate that anniversary in company with the Catholic Aid Agency, which have been rebuilding houses and communities there. I was on the east coast of the island, where there is a patchwork of villages of different beliefs, some Hindu, some Muslim, some Christian. It was a visit of great joy, as well as witnessing great suffering. In one Hindu village, they were not too sure how to explain who or what a cardinal was, and I was introduced as a member of the Roman Catholic High Command. But what struck me very forcibly was the practical dialogue of life between the different faiths as they tried to rebuild their lives. In one Muslim village, the leader told me many came and went, promising things, but only the Catholics stayed and built us our new houses. The Catholic aid workers who helped those villages, most of them young adults, didn't engage in theological dialogue. They weren't there as missionaries to try to persuade anybody to convert. But by their actions and by the villagers' welcome of them and of me, there was a moving example of mutual solidarity, dare I say love, which stirred in me the desire to see such love characterize Catholic-Muslim relations in our world. Community is hugely important to a postmodern culture, which is suspicious of institutions and top-down evangelization. One of the most profoundly moving experiences in the evangelization of young people is the experience of a shared faith journey. Young people meet Jesus in each other and on the way. It seems to me that an experience of communion must be encouraged in parishes and dioceses. There are all sorts of ways in which that can be achieved. Pilgrimages, justice and peace work, fellowship groups, and even more powerful, some kind of experience of community life. I've found, for instance, bringing young people to the Lord or gatherings of different kinds enormously helpful. I'm delighted, of course, that the World Youth Day is going to be held here in Australia in 2008, which will be a great opportunity for many of the young people here in your country and elsewhere. How often it is like Jesus on the way to Emmaus with the disciples. The Lord speaks to young people as they gather together and listen to his word and to each other. As they walk together, they discover him walking beside them. When they share their table, participate in the Eucharist together, they discover the living Lord breaking bread with them and sending them forth in the power of his risen Spirit. I was very glad when Pope John Paul, in his letter Novo Millenia Ineunte, this beginning of a new millennium, praises the vitality of communities and movements within the Church as God's gift to us. They represent a true springtime of the Spirit. And Pope John Paul goes on to echo the warning of St. Paul, do not quench the Spirit, do not despise prophesying, but test everything and hold fast to what is good. There is no doubt in my mind that loving Christian communities are places of evangelization in today's world. I remember many years ago, the directors of a firm came to see me when I was rector of a seminary in Rome. And they asked me what was the essence of the Catholic Church, what was very important that marks the Catholic Church. So I told them to speak to some of the students, but when I saw the program, which was called The Long Search, and its long section on the Catholic Church, two things they picked out of uniqueness for them and the Catholic Church were a vibrant Catholic family, father, mother, children, and the way they live their faith, and a living community of men and women, the little brothers and sisters of Charles de Foucauld, witnessing in a quiet and simple way in their daily lives, following St. Francis' advice, preach the gospel, if necessary, use words. The search for God in prayer and the search for community are the first two treasures of the Church which she can offer to the young in the face of our contemporary society. And surely the third must be that of discovering the poor, the needy. This is something young know instinctively. They're scandalized by any show of religion which does not have an eye to the most needy. I find young people today are very generous, very open, very willing to reach out to those who are on the margins. The words of St. Matthew ring true for them in a particular way. I was hungry, said Jesus. You gave me to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. I was a stranger, you made me welcome. Naked, and you covered me. Sick, and you visited me. In prison, and you came to see me. When did we see you hungry, feed you, thirsty, and give you to drink, naked, and clothe you, sick or in prison, and go to see you? Jesus said, inasmuch as you did it to the least of my brothers and sisters, you did it to me. I had a brother who was a brother priest. He's dead now. But in his time, he was a marvelous prison chaplain. And you know, in prisons, there's a sort of hierarchy. There's the governor, prison officers, and so on. And the prisoners are at the bottom of the pile. Well, Father Pat, my brother, was always on the side of the prisoners. He laughed with them. He helped them. He was their Father Pat. And I suppose, because he, a man of religion, as it were, on their side, they got the impression that it was possible for God to be on their side. Very important. That's the kind of option for the poor. God does not forget the poor, the prisoner, the sick. God's on their side, and if we're on their side, somehow we inherit the kingdom. I like my brother Pat's story about when he was a chaplain. A prisoner came along and said at the Sunday Mass they'd like to have this particular hymn, which there was no problem having the hymn. Anyway, the next week, 3 prisoners, including that one, they broke out of the prison. And after a couple of days were recaptured, they came the next Sunday, this prisoner came up to my brother, Father Pat, and said, "Father, I'm really, really sorry about asking you for that hymn. The hymn I asked you that we sang last Sunday," and then my brother remembered the name of the hymn, which was "Sweet Saviour, Bless Us Ere We Go." But it's a very serious point. Just a few weeks ago, I was in Lourdes and went to visit a community called the Cenacular, kind of the upper room. It was an extraordinarily moving experience. It was a house of 40 men, all of whom had been drug addicts. Many of them had been on drugs for years and had found all efforts to get them off drug addiction had come to nothing. But through the inspiration of a sister Elvira, 50 of these homes had been founded. They're communities which rely totally on providence. There's a regular life of prayer and work. Each one was given a guardian when they came to help them over the very difficult times when they were tempted to leave and go back to their addiction. Each, through prayer, through community, through their service to each other, had found not only that they were able to overcome their addiction, but also had found a peace and meaning to their lives. And that community was a glimpse of the kingdom of God, which is not won without effort and difficulty. It's like the pearl of great price, which having been found brings great joy. I remember one of them saying to me, "We are taught to have a mind to the person beside us in whatever we are doing, whether it is making a meal, painting a wall, working in the field. It moves us beyond ourselves to look at the other." And I think that's something that young people crave. They need, yes, prayer, they need community, they need service to each other and to the needy, and that brings forth their image, the other lung in their lives, that is the lung of the need and search and fulfillment in God. So in experience such a community, I only thought of the words of the Beatitude, "Blessed are the poor, for they shall inherit the kingdom." So I'm coming to the end of this lecture. I could go on speaking about the different forms of service to others, but it seems to me that everyone in small communities or individually must find each their own way of seeking out the way that they want to live more closely, that aspect of the kingdom which is to reach out to the poor. Those three aspects, prayer, community, service to others, here are the age-old means by which all of us, but especially young people, seek and find the kingdom of God here on earth. So it's good to remind ourselves of the Spirit of God which makes the church live, leaves it open ever and again to the life and words of Jesus. For our church is the way and not the objective. She's the means, not the end in itself. She's the way to the kingdom of God, and therefore she must continually evangelize herself. The cultivation of contemplation of prayer, faith communities, silence, is the music that allows us to turn towards a tranquil rhythm of life and discover new sources. I see the church as being a prophetic sign of fraternal communion, a kind of home. People are nourished and fed in these communities. Communities which swim against the current, but that's our natural habit in today's world. So I'm not at all pessimistic about the future, but rather full of hope. My motto, as has been said, is Gaudium et Spes, joy and hope, and that's how I think we should be as we look to the future. I'd like to end with just telling you a story about one of my favorite popes. They're all my favorite popes, but this one is Pope John. And Pope John, on his 80th birthday, gave a party in the Vatican they gave a party for him to celebrate his birthday. Anyway, they were all there, cardinals, archbishops, bishops, monsignori, but also a little group of very peasant people from his home village of Sotto il Monte. And so they were there in their best suits, looking a bit uncomfortable amidst all the grandees of the Vatican. So Pope John comes in. As you know, some of you remember, he was short and rather stout, but he came up and he said, "Thank you very much for coming to wish me a happy birthday. But I want to speak, first of all, to this group who've come down from my home village of Soto il Monte. So he said to the group, "Dear friends, thank you so much for coming to wish me a happy birthday." And he said, if things were different, I'd like to have taken you out to a ristorante, and we'd have had pasta and vino and talk about old times. But he said, we can't always do what we want to do. When I left Soto il Monte to go to the seminary, I went to the seminary and it was very cold and the food was rotten. And I used to say to myself, Angelo, his name was Angelo Roncalli, Angelo, this is no place for you. But then I thought to myself, well, God has brought me here and I must trust him. So he said, and then I was ordained a priest, and I soon became the bishop's secretary, and I had to carry his bags, drive him around, do all sorts of things. Oh, I'm sorry, Father Mark, that I didn't particularly want to do. And occasionally I'd say to myself, Angelo, this is no place for you. But then I thought, well, God's brought me here, I must trust him. And he said, and then eventually I was asked to join the Vatican diplomatic service, and I was sent to Turkey, and I was sent to Bulgaria, and I got messages from the Vatican telling me who to see, what to say, and I used to send back messages. It was very boring, he said. And often I'd say to myself, Angelo, this is no place for you. But then I thought, well, God has brought me here, I must trust him. But then he said I was made Archbishop of Venice, and I was very happy, because at last, he said, I'm going to be the pastor, the shepherd of my people, something I've always wanted. But then he said, after a number of years, my predecessor, Pope Pius XII, died, and I went to Rome for the conclave to elect the new pope. And as I went into the conclave, I said to myself, Angelo, they wouldn't, would they? But they did, he said. And here I am, surrounded by cardinals and bishops, who I'd much rather be out with you, he said, having a festa. But then he said, but God has brought you where you are, and he's brought me where I am, and we must trust him. And I've always taken that message to heart, because it seems to me, all the community here, and the people, all of you, each of us has a calling in a different way from God. He's brought you where you are, he's brought me where I am. And we must trust him, because God has his purposes beyond all our understanding for our world, for our communities, and for the church. And also, particularly for the young people. God loves them, and I think in a very special way, because they're full of hope, full of joy, full of expectation. So we must pray for them, and I know they too will pray for us. Thank you.
We're going to have two very distinguished people giving a short reflection on His Eminence address. And the first is Rabbi John Levy, a pioneer of interreligious dialogue. He's taught many units in Judaism and Jewish studies at a number of Catholic seminaries and theological institutions, currently Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Beth Israel, and maintains an active role in supporting our community. I'll now invite Rabbi Levy to share with us his reflections. Thank you.
Early in your speech, you spoke of a sense of homelessness, a diminished sense of community, and belonging, which is high on the loss side. And I thought that's how Australia began. We took a continent from the indigenous Australians. We were homeless. We had a diminished sense of community because we had come here as exiles. And the community of Australia in the colonial times had no sense of belonging. It had a high sense of loss. So whatever has happened since then has been an improvement after 1788. And it's something that Australia has, which is special, a sense of building a community. And it's a community which constantly surprises us. And it's a great pleasure to speak within the Australian Catholic University auspices, because this is one of the great surprises of post-war Australia and one of the strengths. And I believe that we should acknowledge this. And if this new chapter in the university's life leads to new things, we will not be surprised, because that's the way in which Australia is. And that we can gather together, Christians, Muslims and Jews, and salute this new discipline and this new faculty is a great privilege. The Cardinal referred to two very special men, John the 23rd, Angelo, and John Paul. And when I think of John the 23rd, of course, we all remember the Second Vatican Council. And for Jewish people, that council opened an entirely new chapter in the relationship between the Church and the Jewish people, symbolized by many acts of recognition. Extraordinary new chapter. And then John Paul and his visit to Israel and standing at the Western Wall, at the Temple Mount, and putting a little paper in between the stones on which was written the prayer for peace. And then standing at the Holocaust Memorial and weeping as he remembered his classmates in Poland who had died in the Holocaust. These are images which were recalled again by Pope Benedict when he returned to Germany as Pope, as Pontiff, and visited the synagogue in Cologne. That's the still small voice that was referred to in the lecture. Within all the earthquakes and fire and storm with which we live, we wait to hear the still small voice. And that is the voice of God, and that calls us all to greater understanding. So, Your Eminence, you didn't blow it. And we've felt privileged to be here, to be part of this ceremony. We congratulate the Turkish community in particular for their unique contribution to the multi-faith life of Australia. And we congratulate the Australian Catholic University for having the foresight to grasp the chance. And we say we're glad, very glad, that you have all come. Thank you.
Earlier we had introduced to us Professor Zeki Sarpatolek, and he of course is currently very distinguished Professor of Islamic Studies at John Carroll University, Cleveland, Ohio, and I welcome him now to give his brief reflection on His Eminence's address.
Your Eminence, Cardinal O'Connor, Your Grace, the Archbishop Hart, Your Eminence Mehmet Ali Şengül, the official representative of His Excellency Fethullah Gülen, Brother Julian MacDonald, Chancellor of Australian Catholic University, Professor Peter Sheehan, the Vice-Chancellor of Australian Catholic University, Professor Gabriel McMillan, Provost Vice Chancellor of Australian Catholic University. It's a great pleasure to respond His Eminence lecture. I should say that it's a piece of art. I really enjoyed it. I had a chance to read it prior to his delivering. It was only 1 hour, so I had a quick look at it, and then after listening, I really enjoyed it. I found a great common themes between Islamic tradition and what he mentioned. I think if I mention all of this, it will take probably 45 minutes to elaborate on all points that he mentioned. But I will be very brief and try to just summarize some of these aspects. His Eminence mentioned briefly the Second Vatican Council. Rabbi John Levy also has mentioned this event. It reminded me of a prominent Turkish Islamic scholar who promoted interfaith dialogue, particularly between Muslims and Christians, in his famous sermon called Damascus Sermon in 1912, almost 50 years before Nostra Aetate. In this sermon, it's very interesting. At that time, it was very tumultuous time. People were almost in fight, almost was the beginning of the First World War. He was saying that the world peace will be achieved through cooperation between Muslims and Christians. It's important to note that only the members of Abrahamic family constitute more than half of humanity. So really, if they come together and cooperate, and this chair will be a reflection of this, I hope they will bring peace to the world. This significant point that I like to add that His Eminence reminded me. Also, His Eminence mentioned several problems of our time. I think the problems that he mentioned, problems such as poverty, the relationship between the poor and the rich, are all common, and these problems are also the problems of Muslim nations and Islamic communities as well. So, Muslim-Christian dialogue, Muslim-Christian cooperation will take an important step to overcome these problems. Problems of racism, problems of poverty, problems of corruption, all these hopefully will be solved through Muslim-Christian cooperation. One thing that he also mentioned, the story of Canadian author when he says, I will tell you a secret. And that is, at the end he says, I cannot do without God. It is very essential in the Islamic teaching, which is in fact considered the highest goal of humanity, to believe in God. The highest goal, nothing is higher than that, and that is to believe in God. Because 1/3 of the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, is about God. The second, when Muslim scholars enumerate the important things in the Islamic tradition, the first one is to believe in God. The second one is to know God. Belief is one level, knowing God is second level, and the third one is to love God, which is the highest level of knowledge and love of God. Therefore, these are essential themes in the Islamic tradition, and I agree totally with His Eminence about these Islamic principles. He mentioned also prayer. I should also say that 1/4 of the Quran, the Holy Book of Islam, is about prayer. Varieties of prayer. Prayer of Moses, prayer of Jesus, prayer of Muhammad, prayer of all other messengers of God. Peace and blessings be upon all of them. These are essential elements in the teaching of Islam. So the cooperation between Muslims and Christians will bring them to understand and acknowledge these essential elements that unite these adherents of these two great world traditions. And finally, I like to finish with a statement related to Fethullah Gülen, His Excellency, after him that it is planned to name the future chair in Islamic Studies. There is a quote that I enjoyed having this quote, and I like to share with you, and then I will end my comments with this quote. He says, "The duty of Muslims is to help those who have fallen down, to generate a smile at the face of the hearts and lips that have forgotten smiles. Through this, the hearts that have forgotten laughter will enjoy it again. They should erase the worry that has become a culture in the life of many people with the magic of trustworthiness. Their life should be a reference for many, for the hopeless people who believe that humanity will never resurrect again. The Muslims' duty is to blow a new life into their spirits." Thank you very much.
Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor is the Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster in London. In 2006, he came to Australia as a special guest of the Aquinas Academy. Whilst here, he gave 3 public lectures. This is the first of those lectures, given in Sydney on August the 27th, 2006. It is entitled Belief and Belonging.
Your Eminence, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here. I didn't realise there'd be quite so many of you. You know the story of the bishop who went to a parish, and there were very few people in the church, and he said to the parish priest, "Father, there are very few people here. Didn't you tell them the bishop was coming?" And the parish priest said, "No, my lord, but the news must have leaked out somehow." So, whatever news has leaked out, I don't know. But anyway, here I am in your wonderful city of Sydney. And I'm just delighted to be here. A lovely welcome from the Cardinal and from everybody I've met here in the city. My earliest recollection, or rather, my earliest connection with Australia is a religious one. I had a great, I think other great uncle. He was born in 1815, just about the time of Waterloo, in West Cork. He was ordained a priest, and after 12 years, at the age of 32, he became the youngest bishop in the world, and was appointed to Hyderabad in India. He was there as bishop for 25 years, and then for health reasons he returned to Ireland, and with good Irish beef and mutton, he recovered his health. And they decided to send him even further away to Tasmania. And he was bishop in Tasmania for 36 years. And having been the youngest bishop in the world, he became the oldest bishop in the world. He became an archbishop because Hobart was made an archdiocese. And it was said, because he had 1 or 2 nephews in the diocese, that he wanted one of his nephews to succeed him. But I think, rumour had it at the time that the priests had enough of the Murphys. So anyway, I just want to assure Cardinal Pell I've not come to Australia coveting either his or any other diocese in this. So I'm just delighted to be here. Just over 2 years ago, I was invited to participate in a public debate commemorating 250 years of the founding of the Royal Society of Arts. This was a society brought together in London for the greatest thinkers in science, technology, and the arts over the past 2.5 centuries. This particular gathering was held in the Albert Hall with about 3,000 people present. Before me, there were 4 short speeches, about 10 minutes each, by people most eminent in their field. A scientist, a humanist, an astronomer, and to celebrate progress in business, the chief executive of something called Starbucks. You know, I'd never been in Starbucks till I met this gentleman, but there are a lot around London. I imagine there's a few here too. But when my turn came, I too spoke of the benefits that had been achieved in science and technology, but then went on to say something else. What an extraordinary thing that the questions which the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, had sought to answer had now come to haunt our world. We are all green now because we realize that we're stewards of this earth and we cannot ravage it. It's been given to us. Progress has enabled us to provide food for everyone in this planet. But a quarter of the world is starving, and another quarter live perhaps in superabundance. We are able to probe the processes of life and experiment in cloning and other forms of genetic engineering. But who is to decide what is a human being? Or is this just an irrelevance? It is here that we hear the words of the beginning of Genesis. God made us in his own image and likeness. Now, this is not an obsolete myth, but a key to a new understanding of life in this world. But what was astonishing for me was how eager people were to hear another voice, another approach that seemed to indicate the deepest quest of the human heart for meaning and for hope. Which is why I'm a little sorry that I entitled this lecture, Belief and Belonging in a Faithless World. It would be better entitled, Belief and Belonging in a World Seeking Faith. It is quite clear to me that you cannot separate religion and life. You cannot suppress people's yearning for joy and for hope. Nearly 30 years ago, when I was made a bishop, I chose as my episcopal motto those very words, Gaudium et Spes, joy and hope. These words are, in fact, the beginning of the Second Vatican Council's document, Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World. This is how it begins. The joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor and in any way afflicted, these are the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of Christ. Indeed, nothing genuinely human fails to raise an echo in their hearts. Right from the start, that document asks us to refuse any attempt to divorce our spiritual life from our day-to-day encounters with women and men and their joys and hopes, their griefs and their anxieties. From time to time in the history of the Church, there's been phases of a kind of enthusiasm that makes people think that real religion, real spiritual life, is confined to those occasions where we leave the world behind. Genuine spiritual ecstasy is very rare. But the saint is someone who can't wait to get back to spreading the good news. To do that effectively, we have to be committed to our culture, to where we live, in the sense of being able to converse with all our brothers and sisters, those who share our faith, those who don't, and even those who don't want to. Indeed, depending on the way we say them or hear them, many of the prayers in our liturgy, especially the Mass, have a different attitude to our culture, because ever since the incarnation of our Lord Jesus Christ, the created world has had an even greater dignity than it had before. Those prayers, understood correctly, plead with us not to forget that there is more waiting for us beyond this life, but also to bloom where we are planted. We are to commit ourselves to improving this world rather than despising it. We are not outside or above our culture. We are part of it. And it is in this context that we live our Christian life. Nevertheless, it is remarkable to me how our society, and I would include Australia as well as most of the countries of Europe, it is remarkable how our society seems to be losing its faith in no faith. What is in decline, properly speaking, is the certainty of uncertainty. I have found that British people, for example, are less and less wedded to an avowedly agnostic or atheist position. Young people in particular would increasingly define themselves as spiritual, but not religious. They are interested in faith and are believers in some sort of God. Many practice a kind of prayer or meditation, which is principally experiential. But before we look closer at this, it's worth pausing to note just how substantial is this shift. It means that the Enlightenment, with its concentration on the power of human reason, and which was always hostile to what was not empirically observable or rationally quantifiable, no longer holds sway. It means that the ideologies of the 18th century, logical positivism, secularism, rationalism, are collapsing alongside other ideologies. In an article in a Sunday newspaper recently, I described this as a secular wobble. Not the death of secularism, certainly not, but a diagnosis at least of its terminal decline. We should be cautious about describing this as a religious revival, but it would be safe to describe it as a revival of a sense of religion, or at least a revival of an interest in religion. In Europe, there are many indications of this, especially among the young, who now seek out courses in religion and spirituality in a way that has not been seen in my lifetime. So too the popularity of retreats and meditation. There is an affirmation in all of this of the place of the soul, a belief in the infinite value of human love, for example. There is the desire for a sense of well-being and oneness with the universe, and the beginnings of a search for transcendence, by which I mean a recognition of the possibility that life is much more than we can visibly see, touch, or hear. The same is true, I have been reading, in Australia. In the words of the sociologist Gary Boomer, spiritualities of choice, as opposed to religions of birth, are growing in Australia. He sees this as the tip of the iceberg of a renewed religiosity. Again, we should be careful about thinking of this as a revival. It is better described, again, as a spurning of no religion. Those who chose no religion in the 2001 census showed a decrease in both absolute numbers and percentage of the population for the first time in Australian history. But asked what their religion was, people chose not so much the classical affiliations of Australian religious tradition, Catholic, Anglican, Jewish, and so on, Free Church, but hundreds of eclectic new categories, personal beliefs that were at once universal and at the same time highly personal. They expressed what the Anglican sociologist Grace Davey, in her 1994 study, Religion in Britain, since 1945, captured as the classic postmodern religious statement, I believe, but I do not belong. It's too crude to say that the loss of faith in no faith has bypassed classic religion. In my own diocese of Westminster, our congregations are in many ways increasing, mainly due to the large number of migrants who bring such a richness to our celebration of our faith. Over the last 3 years, we've had record numbers of catechumens and candidates seeking reception into the church at Easter time. Westminster Cathedral, if any of you have been there, is not a small place, but this year's rite of election, when those being received into the church gather with their bishop, it meant we had to have two ceremonies in order to accommodate the RCIA, the rite of the Christian initiation of adults and their relatives. The cathedral was absolutely packed, both times. I think the last time it was so packed was at my installation as Archbishop, nearly 7 years ago. I remember there was a lady who everybody had to have a ticket for that. And this lady an Irish lady tried to get in. She didn't have a ticket. And so she begged the ushers, and the usher said, "No ticket, you can't get in." And she said, "I've come all the way from Ireland for this." So they relented and let her in. And I happened to meet her afterwards. And I said, "Well, you were very lucky to get in." And she said, I told them I'd come all the way from Ireland, but I didn't tell them I came all the way from Ireland 40 years ago. So you've got to have a little bit of cunning. But it's a fact that those who are at Mass today are more likely to have chosen to be there and to know why they are there. For many, this is a result of a journey of faith and prayer and what we might call a conversion of heart. The depth of such faith is not readily measurable, and certainly not in statistics, but as I go around my diocese, I see much proof of it. I don't want to sound in any way complacent or self-satisfied. But if I do not believe that the contemporary church in Britain, in Europe, any more than in Australia, is as much in decline as statistics sometimes seem to indicate, I certainly do not wish to diminish the scale of the challenge to the church in the present landscape. For a long time now, perhaps since the days of the transatlantic slave trade, there has been the complex phenomenon that has now hit most societies, and that is multiple belonging. There is no doubt that a significant number of ordinary Christians in many countries are becoming more and more fascinated with some of the practices in other religions. They are not usually interested in the teachings of these religions, but in meditation, healing, or some kind of alternative therapy. I know, and I suppose most of us here know, that we have the fullness in our spiritual Catholic tradition. But one of the biggest challenges facing us in the church in our contemporary society is to find the language and the contexts in which people can listen anew to what we have to offer. That challenge is formidable and may be described simply in the form of a question. How do we offer what is truly life-saving, but not easy, to a society in which values of consumer comfort and consumer choice are all pervasive? Consumerism has the power to make Christian teaching unintelligible, not so much in theory as in practice. There seems to be no room for our teaching on sacrifice or the redemptive value of suffering, which opens our hearts to God and each other. How extraordinary were the events just a year and four months ago following the death of Pope John Paul. Cardinal Pell and I, who of course remember it particularly well, I have to say that during the time between the death of Pope John Paul and the election of Pope Benedict, both he and I were treated with enormous respect in the Vatican and in Rome itself, just in case. But there were millions of people in Rome itself for the funeral, but countless millions watching by means of television, marveling at the faith displayed by the people there. When I returned to England after the conclave, so many people, not Christian, not Catholic, said to me how riveted they were during those days following the death of Pope John Paul, the election of Pope Benedict. I suppose for the first time, you see, they saw visually what is at the heart of Christian teaching, the Catholic Church, namely prayer, thanksgiving to God, belief in a life after death, and above all, a faith in the real presence of Christ amongst us. Those days, culminating in the election of Pope Benedict, were indeed a blessing for the Church and will never be forgotten by those who witnessed it. I'm reminded of a marvelous document by Pope John the 23rd in 1961, which has a lot to say about a Christian attitude to our culture and to our world. The encyclical letter was called Mater et Magistra, and this is how he spoke about the Church. Mother and teacher of all nations, Such is the Catholic Church in the mind of her founder, Jesus Christ, to hold the world in an embrace of love. To her was entrusted the twofold task of giving life to her children and of teaching them and guiding them, both as individuals and as nations, with maternal care. I find that a very bold but encouraging image of the Church. As a bishop, I've always felt particularly responsible for making sure that is how people experience the Church, not only as teacher of dogmas, but also, perhaps even more, a loving mother who loves me, who loves us, and because she loves us, wants us to go the right way through life. That's the kind of teacher the Church is and can be, and I've been so grateful for it in my own life. Our attitude, therefore, to our culture should never be one of superiority or disdain. We've no right to look down on our culture because, to a certain extent, we are its sons and daughters. I'm convinced that we're there to have a real attitude, a positive attitude to our culture, to accept it, though we can never be blind to its limitations. I heard a moving account from a priest working in a poor parish of the day a woman from the parish came with an offering for a mass. He was convinced something was wrong and asked if all was well, and she looked tired. She told him her son had stolen everything she had and had attacked her several times, and she'd had to call the police and have him arrested. The priest asked her if it was drugs, which it was. And just a day or two earlier, she'd been in court when her son was sentenced to a time in prison. She said, "Father, I know it was the right thing, but I cried. He is my son, you know." The loving mother commits herself to her children for life. She can weep for them, be angry, but she can never lose that bond. So it is with Holy Mother Church, as we used to say. She has the duty to guide her children, but whatever they do, they should never abandon them. A great theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, was getting at this idea with his idea of the Marian principle, when he showed the risk of too much masculinity in the structures of the Church. Most of us will remember how some teachers can appear severe and more interested in the subject than in their pupils, while others are able to combine high standards with genuine care for the people they teach. When the Church gets too concerned with its own structures and its own image, it risks having a very uncaring face. A good teacher who is also gentle is one we will remember with joy for the rest of our lives. And Mother Church is that kind of teacher too. What have I said so far? Christianity looks beyond this world, but our hearts and minds are firmly rooted in the concerns of all our fellow men and women. Just as we do not look down on God's created universe, we are in no position to sneer in a cynical way at our culture. Like a mother, we realize that part of love for a child is guidance and occasionally correction. This is the image the Church is surely meant to purvey in her teaching and in her actions. Accusations of our failures in that area have been given as reasons for people looking elsewhere. People find it hard to belong to the old institutions these days, and yet there is clearly a widespread and widely felt need for spiritual satisfaction. And people seem prepared to pick and mix elements of different spiritual traditions. It is hard sometimes to know what they are in religious terms and what they would consider themselves to be. In all of this, I feel the Church has a great deal to offer. And the challenge is, will we be brave enough to make the most of what we have and which our society is so desperately in need of receiving? I think there are three experiences that could help people on their journey to finding God in and through their Catholic life, their Christian life. Basically, I think the best things we can offer people are the experience of family, experience of silence, and the experience of contemplation. The Dominican theologian and poet Paul Murray says something I like. As all of us are well aware by now, there is a new fascination among our contemporaries with the things of the Spirit. Unfortunately, however, that interest doesn't always translate into a capacity to attend to the living voice of God or surrender with faith and hope and love to the transcendent beauty and pressure of divine revelation. Instead, there is a tendency to live one's spirituality within the bubble of the self and practice what Martin Buber has called, in a memorable phrase, the religion of pure psychic immanence. The experience that I think would moderate or even overcome this tendency to dwell in the self is what I have referred to as the experience of family. I'm not only thinking in the purely literal sense. I suppose I was lucky growing up. My parents were very convinced believers who lived a very devout Christian life, who passed on to myself and my brothers and sister a series of values that introduced us to a larger family, the Catholic Church. But what I now realize is that what was terribly important was that those values, that life of my parents was personal, it was sustained, and it was a positive experience. Just very recently I was asked by a mother who was obviously worried about her children. She said to me, Cardinal, I have my children, I pray for them, but I'm not sure whether they're going to be practicing their faith anymore. What more can I do? I said to her, as well as praying, just convey to them your happiness in being a disciple of Jesus, your happiness in being a member of the Church of Jesus Christ. That will communicate. Many will have come past the church door, may feel curious or even inwardly recognize that here they may find what they need. But the welcome they receive within the church community needs to be personal, sustained, and positive. People should not be allowed to have the impression that faith of the church is a private thing. Some 20 years ago, I received into the Catholic Church a certain man called Malcolm Muggeridge, a noted writer and journalist. For years, Malcolm had come to believe in Jesus Christ as the light of the world and endeavored to reform his life and live as a true disciple of Jesus. But only gradually, through the example, I think, of Mother Teresa of Calcutta and a certain priest, did he come to realize that you cannot be a believer or a disciple of Jesus alone. You need to be in communion with others, to be part of a community we call the church. There was a marvelous moment when Malcolm and his wife Kitty were confirmed and received Holy Communion for the first time. I remember it well. He was quite a small man, and so was his wife, and I had said because he was very famous, that there was to be no reporters. Unfortunately, one man managed to get in, and as you know, I'm rather tall, and so there was me confirming them with my mitre on, and the next day in the front pages was me leaning over these rather small people, and the headline, "The Catholic Church has got them." It wasn't meant to be like that. But then, that was an important experience. You see, Jesus said, where two or three are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. It doesn't matter, 2 or 3, 50, 100, 1,000, millions, gathered together in a communion of life and faith and love. Crucial. In our society today, there are many, especially in England, but maybe here in Australia too, the fastest growing churches are what they call house churches. They are sect-like. And I think they're growing because many people have a quest for belonging, a search for answers, search for cultural identity, for intimacy, a wish to be recognized, to feel special, wanting something of the transcendent. And I think to myself, but we are in the church have treasures we're not using. A Vatican reflection on New Age stressed, the simplest, the most obvious, and the most urgent measure to be taken, which might also be the most effective, would be to make the most of the riches of the Christian spiritual heritage. The great religious orders have strong traditions of meditation and spirituality, which could be made more available through courses or periods in which their houses might welcome genuine seekers. As some of you will know, this has been done successfully in England recently in a rather unusual way. In 2005, and again this year, the BBC set up an encounter between typical modern spiritual searchers and a very traditional countercultural expression of religion. The first set of programs was called The Monastery. It was filmed in the Benedictine community at Worth Abbey in Sussex, in my former diocese, where 5 young men were invited to share the community's life for 40 days. You know, the program was so popular that by the end of it, there were 3 million people turning in to see it. And this year, 4 young women joined the community of Poor Clares in Arundel for a similar series of programs entitled The Convent. One of the key elements in the success of these 2 programs was that the young seekers were given such a genuine welcome and made to feel part of the family. I often try to put myself into the mind of a person who is wondering about stepping into a church, either for the first time or after a very long time away. I wonder if the people inside would make me feel welcome or at ease, or whether there would be any welcome at all. The importance of a generous welcome, I think, was the keynote of it shone out in each of these 2 programs. As a Catholic Christian, I'm convinced I belong to a special family. And I recognize that I probably have a lot to learn about how best to make casual visitors or serious seekers feel at home. They need to feel part of the family or they will not stay. And when they stay, they must continue to feel welcome, or it will seem like a sham, a trick to get them to join our club. This is hard, as Jesus knew, which is why he told the parable about the 99 good sheep. The shepherd knew he didn't have to worry about. And the one about the son who felt ignored by his father, and particularly offended when his brother came home from wasting his life. We can appear to take people for granted. Fawning over them would be insincere and silly, but nevertheless, people must somehow know they matter to God and to their fellow sisters and brothers. I know that is true, but we need a good recipe in all our parishes and all our communities to put it into practice. The biggest shock for the young men and women taking part in these programs was their introduction to the world of silence. Not any old silence, but contemplative silence. "Listen, my son," are the first words of the rule of St. Benedict. And this was the first thing the monks and the nuns tried to impress on their visitors. It's not easy. It wasn't easy for these young men and women at the beginning, but over the weeks they did in fact learn to listen more deeply. The move from a world bombarded by noise and rapidly changing pictures to a silent world that changes slowly and rarely is a bewildering experience. So people need to be accompanied on this road that can be lonely. But it's the beginning of a genuine prayer life. I'm sure you won't mind if I ask you all a personal question. How often do you experience true silence? Unless you are one of those people who goes on retreat frequently or are a totally antisocial being, your world, like my world, will be just like the one in which those young people in the monastery and the convent left for 40 days. But most of us have had a chance, perhaps many times, to enter that silent world where contemplative religious have almost carved out a presence and marked not only space but also time with what I can only call holiness. It is obvious, as St. Augustine said, that one cannot give what one does not have. And this is true of the ability to use silence or to allow silence to prepare us to meet God. It would have been very odd for those young men and women if they had been forced to be silent by people who did not themselves live silence. Likewise, we cannot expect people interested in meeting God to be silent if we are not. Lived silence is a detachment that can give us space to look at the world around us, at our culture, and see what is really there. We've all heard of information overload, and we've all most likely experienced it frequently. To stay sane, we need to be able to decide what is worth ignoring and what is valuable. So silence is a discipline that is not easy to learn, but one that can only help in discernment of sense and nonsense, good and bad, apparent and genuine holiness. One obstacle is something Blaise Pascal pointed out nearly 400 years ago. He was convinced that all our problems come from the fact we cannot cope with quiet and inactivity, even though we often complain we've too much to do. He seems to be onto something. It can be a real effort to detach ourselves from our busy schedules and seek out the silence that can reveal so much to us. We know it is not easy, and we know how important it is. So I think if we think of how to bring people closer to believing and belonging, we have to recognize that we as church need to guide and accompany them on this journey towards holiness, towards contemplation, towards God. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in Rome produced a document some time ago on meditation. It keeps coming back to an essential point. Meditative techniques can do all sorts of things, usually good things, to our psychological, mental, and bodily state. But unless there is an encounter with the living God, these techniques, worthy and as effective as they are not yet prayer. I mention this to underline what I've already said about silence, that is not simply absence of noise, but a way to contemplation. Anyone can sit quietly, but religious silence is a search tool, even better than a Google. I've mentioned a few times my conviction that every Christian must have a real care for his brothers and sisters, and to that end must not only understand, but try to empathize with their deepest concerns. I have hinted at the fact that we also have our sights on God's world too. We would not be Christians if we restricted our horizon to what we can see, hear, and touch. It seems to me that people want us not just to speak about spiritual things, but to show them where the source of their thirst can be quenched. They want us not merely to tell them about Jesus Christ, but in some sense to show him to them. But that could never work unless, as Pope John Paul emphasized, we ourselves had not first contemplated his face. If Christianity is the meeting place of earth and heaven, Jesus is the meeting place of human and divine life. You see, there is not much point welcoming and being concerned unless we really have spiritual nourishment to offer people. And I think the best spiritual nourishment is to meet people whose lives have been touched and deeply affected by contemplating Jesus. Nothing can replace that. And people will know if what we are offering is second-hand or the real thing. A couple of years ago, the Archbishop of Prague, Cardinal O'Connor, came to visit me. He shared with me something of his experience during the communist occupation of his country. He was persecuted as a priest by the authorities and was eventually thrown out of his parish. He was told by the authorities, the communists, that he couldn't practice as a priest and had to make his own way in the world. He became a window cleaner and worked for 10 years in the city of Prague. One day, he told me, he was cleaning windows in one of Prague's busy streets, and he could hear German tourists below him. They were talking and laughing and thinking about what they would buy in the shops. And he said he began to think to himself, no one knows who I am. No one knows I am a priest. No one knows about Jesus. No one knows about the gospel that I was ordained to preach. And he confided in me his sense of abandonment and isolation. And then he went on to say, very beautifully, it struck me, he said, he struck me very deeply, a voice within me. The cross is not just a pious object. On the cross, God is present but hidden. And it's a reality in my life. And if Jesus could live and die in this way, then so could I. Several years later, the Berlin Wall fell. Shortly afterwards, he was made Archbishop. The motto under the coat of arms of the Venerable English College in Rome, where I was a student and later rector, is written in Latin, Ignum veni mittere in terram. It's a quotation from St. Luke's Gospel that means, I've come to bring fire on the earth. Thousands of men have left the college as priests and walked under those words as they left. What did it mean to them? Someone roughly translated it, I've come to cause trouble. But it really speaks to us of the fire of love in the heart of Christ. Surely a person who contemplates Jesus Christ and gets to know him so well that he or she loves Christ will have that same burning love for the world, which is all the stronger when one remembers what Jesus said next, and how I wish it were burning already, even on the bad days. And we've all had bad days as Christians and in the church, when we're under attack or feel we're not quite up to living our vocation. I know what, and we know what the church can and is, our mother, our teacher, our family. So it just seems to me, my dear friends, that we shouldn't be in any way discouraged as we Christians face our modern world, our modern culture. We're like trout that swim against the stream. Well, that's our natural habitat. We live in our world, but are not of it. The whole history of the church is one of death and resurrection. And we have to trust the Lord will bring about a new outpouring of his Holy Spirit among his people in our countries. Some time ago, I remember a young man coming to me with great enthusiasm. He said, things are terrible, Bishop. What we need is a new Franciscan revolution. And I said to him, I totally agree. Why don't you start it? Have you ever heard the story of the 4 Polish tailors? They all lived in the same street. Times were bad, so one of them put a notice in his window. Here is the best tailor in the town. The second tailor came along and he looked at it and he thought, I'll do a bit better. He put in his window, here is the best tailor in all Poland. Third tailor came along, he looked one, and he looked at another, and he put in his window, come here and see and use the best tailor in the whole wide world. The fourth tailor came along, he looked at the first, and he looked at the second, he looked at the third, he put up in his window, here is the best tailor in the street. So I want to leave you with these few words. It all begins where you are, in your street, in your home, among your friends, among your communities. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. So we all will need and should be courageous and be a people of gaudium et spes, joy and hope. Thank you.
It is my privilege to speak as a young Australian in this forum today. I have been blessed with the opportunity of being able to respond to the much-needed call for social justice in our society today. I agree with you, Cardinal Murphy O'Connor, when you say that it is impossible to separate our religious beliefs from the everyday routine. However, I have often asked myself why young Australians are not able to recognise this. Many seem to only turn to faith when they are in a predicament. In other words, in their griefs and anxieties. For example, prior to my recent HSC trial examinations, I noticed during our prayer bell that every Year 12 girl seemed to pray very silently and intently. This could also be a comment on our society. There is a lot of pressure on students to believe that the final HSC result reflects the person they are. This seems superficial to me. Can a number really represent your soul? Can a number teach you how to cope with the sudden death of a family member? Or feed a starving human being? These things are like faith, immeasurable. And as much as it is hard for us young people today to believe there is life after the HSC, and we will need more than a number to make it through life. The role of our families has become less important in society. However, I believe that family has an integral part to play in teaching beliefs and morals to young people, as well as giving them support and care. My family has played a vital role in my life by shaping the person I am. My parents especially have brought me rather than dragged me to God. The last 2 years have been very important to me in becoming aware of what is important and what is basically trivial. My parents have not only helped me through highly stressful times, but last year gave me the opportunity to respond to a social justice call to Timor with 3 of my peers. This trip allowed me to experience a stark contrast in cultures and backgrounds. It wasn't until I had reached East Timor that I realised how sheltered and fortunate my life had been. I heard stories from people of my own age in East Timor about the 1999 crisis. All of them admit the only thing that helped them through was their faith and their hope. We could all see God in the Timorese people as their faith was so strong. They belong in a world that seeks faith, and they need their faith now more than ever. The immersion trip to East Timor was a unique opportunity that taught me humility, compassion, and forgiveness. It showed me the value of simple relationships that were devoid of the constant distractions of materialism. I believe this made their relationship with God simple but deep. It helped me understand that everyone has a responsibility to look after others in this world. The richness of young people's faith can be realised through selflessness and forgiveness. In the end, we do not really need many of the things that our society suggests are necessary. The more I open my mind to the differences of this world, the more I am able to see God and faith through the joy and hope, grief and anxiety of others. Cardinal O'Connor, on behalf of the young people of the Catholic Church in Australia today, I feel privileged to be able to ask a response from you to my question. What do you see as the future role of our church in helping young people to feel involved and to develop an interest in their faith?
Felicity, thank you very much for what you said and the way you said it. And I wish I had the total answer for how you involve young people in the mission of the church. Except, I'd say, first of all, some of the things you've mentioned yourself. The example of family, crucial, absolutely crucial. And I could give you instances of my own family and how much they influenced me when I was young. The Mass, the prayer, the happiness of that. It isn't the same with all families, but it was a great blessing. And you're reaching out to go to East Timor, very, very moving. But you know, I think one of the things for young people which touches them is when they, as it were, get away out of their normal surroundings and see life from a different angle. Every year I go to Lourdes and I bring a few hundred young people. And there, for the first time, you know, for many of them, they're very just happy to be together. They look after the sick. they pray. And many of the parents, when they come back, they say to me, my Maria, my Felicity, or John, it's as if they've got another lung. They're absolutely changed. But suddenly they've seen the gospel is not just something they have to do, but something that brings them new life. I think also having occasions to kind of not just be together, but to discuss together. Every year in my diocese we have a kind of youth gathering for many hundreds of young people, and they come together. And I went up to it just some weeks ago, and just to be with them, and there they were in groups discussing. So I sat down on the grass with them. I had difficulty getting up, but I sat down, and there they were talking very generously about their own lives and what they can do. And sometimes I think we can underestimate what we can ask young people, because I think they are very generous, and I think that they learn from each other in a way that perhaps wasn't quite so in years past, where we learned from our elders and our grown-ups and so on. That's still true. But I think young people also learn from each other and encouraged by each other. I've also been to a place called Thésée, which is an ecumenical place in Germany, or in France rather, and there they get 5,000 or 6,000 young people sitting down, listening to the Word of God and singing together. Singing has a lot to do with it. So I think I would say, first of all, what will animate young people will be getting them away from their normal environment in some form of pilgrimage. Because when people walk together, when they are talking together on the way, and when they're doing something especially for people in need, then I think they're touched in a particular way. So I think the people of Australia, just like the people in Britain, young people who are not unwilling at all to answer the call of the gospel, but I think it is a challenge for all of us, not just for bishops or priests or religious. It's for the whole. Seems to me, every parish community should be asking itself, what about our young people? How do we involve them? How do we touch them? How do we make efforts to ensure that they have their rightful place in the church? In my next lecture in Melbourne, I'll be talking mostly about young people and how we have not only to speak to them, but listen to them. What's the world like for them? So thank you very much, Felicity. I'll stop there.
Eminence, I have 3 comments that I'd like to make in response to your splendid paper. And the last of these 3 comments leads to my question. Now, the first comment I want to make, I wouldn't have been game to make this afternoon, except that you've given me the imprimatur to do so in your very own words as you developed your thesis in the last little while. When I read the title of your paper, Belief and Belonging in a Faithless World, I didn't like one little bit the description of our world, which of course includes ourselves as faithless. But you came to my rescue and you said that your paper might better have been called Belief and Belonging in a World Seeking Faith. I think that's a splendid title and one which very accurately describes your thesis. You have pointed out that there are many signs of negativity in our world, but many, many signs of hope too. No reason, as you say, to be overconfident of a wholesale U-turn for our secular society to a spiritual and religious revival, but at least a secular wobble is apparent. And I love that description of a secular wobble. Indeed, our Bishop Porteous from Sydney, in an article entitled Faith in God, Love for Church Runs Deep in Generation Y, published in last week's Sydney Catholic Weekly, explores what makes young people born between 1976 and 1990 tick. And Bishop Porteous, like you, also sees evidence of a search for truly spiritual and moral ideals in our society and uses the insightful term Christian humanism. My second comment is one relating to your comments about Gaudium et Spes and to mention the initiative of spirituality in the pub in this context. As you pointed out, the Vatican II's Council's pastoral constitution on the Church in the modern world asks us to refuse any attempt to divorce our spiritual life from our day-to-day encounters with men and women and their joys and hopes, their griefs and anxieties. And you added that to do that effectively, we have to be fully committed to our culture in the sense of being able to converse with all our brothers and sisters, those who share our faith and those who don't, and even those who don't want to. Eminence Catalyst for Renewal, the group behind spirituality in the pub, has this as its aim, to establish forums for conversation where things that matter in life can be discussed in a deep and foundational way with all of those who are interested in a non-threatening and indeed convivial environment. We started 12 years ago wondering if we could put into practice some of the aims of Vatican II at truly grassroots level in a pub in Australia. A big ask, you might say, and would we be a 6-month wonder? 12 years later, we've more or less got a tiger by the tail, with 35 pubs around Australia being spiritual at least one night a month. And in particular, we've just heard that a pub in Boston in the USA has started a spirituality in the pub too. Eminence, so I hope you approve of just one mini local church initiative embedded in a commitment to Vatican II, and in particular to that important document, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, and to use your phrase, an example of something that's happening in a local Australian street. My third comment relates to your reference to the unused treasures of the Church, and you have eloquently explored the mystery and wealth of the spiritual heritage of our Church, in particular in relation to meditative techniques, to silence and family. Now, I think from a different yet connected perspective, there are many other treasures in our Church, and I mention women in particular, but both women and men, those gay and straight, those married and single and divorced, the young, the old, to mention just a little of the diversity of our flock. We all know, I think, that very often the treasures, talents and skills are under-recognised or indeed unknown at parish level. You've also quoted the Vatican as having identified the reasons people are attracted to small groups or sects as including, and I quote, a quest for belonging, a search for wholeness, a need to be recognised and feel special, a search for transcendence. Now, Cardinal, here comes my question. You have acknowledged that in your archdiocese over the last 3 years, you've had a record number of catechumens and candidates seeking reception into the Church at Easter. Now, you've modestly said that your congregations are increasing, largely due to the arrival of migrants. Now, Cardinal Murphy O'Connor, it's not that I don't believe your explanation about migrants, but I believe that you're also attracting treasures of the Church from amongst the ranks of those I have mentioned as well, by making the parishes of your archdiocese places where people fruitfully pursue their quest for belonging, their search for wholeness, are recognised and are made to feel special in their search. So, Eminence, you've already explained and enlarged on the youth, an approach, or many approaches to youth in your archdiocese. And so I'm wondering if, and I think this would probably take you a few days, but I'm just wondering if you could share a couple more of your secrets to help us unearth one or two more of our Church's treasures.
Well, I think I'd like to say something first about some of the people you're talking about, many people in our Church, and not just the women. I'm thinking people who feel a bit alienated from the Church. I'm thinking people, sometimes single mothers, divorced, and all sorts of people. And I'm always very moved when I read or meditate on that passage in the Gospel where Jesus comes to Jacob's well and he meets the woman at Jacob's well. And he knows, if you remember the story, you know, she'd had 5 husbands and she obviously wasn't as good as she might have been. But the first thing that Jesus does isn't to say you should be living a better moral life. He says, give me a glass of water. In other words, do something for me. And all these people, it does seem to me, who do, and there are very large numbers, many of them at Mass on Sunday, we ought to make sure they do feel welcome, in spite of their difficulties, in spite of their problems. I think, and therefore, whatever way we can use that in the local communities, I think is very, 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 very important. The Church is for everyone. The second point I think I'd make is that I really believe that, as I said, that to live a Christian life in today's secular society, you need to swim against the stream. It's not easy. And I'm thinking of the countless thousands of people who come to work in London every day, and many of them young men, young women. And I think, well, a lot of them wanting to live a Christian life. I remember one of them asking me once, what can I do to live a deeper Christian life in my circumstances? I'm a commuter, etc., etc. And my suggestion was, and you'll probably resonate with it, to find other people like yourself, form a small community, meet once a month, read a passage of the gospel, pray, and relate and see how that relates to the circumstances of your life. And you will find how you, in the circumstances of your life, can live more like Christ. In other words, I think I'm saying that apart from your private prayer, and for the prayer of the Eucharist, which is, of course, central and crucial, there's also, you need to be part of some kind of community today. Family, small community, association, very, very important. And I think a lot of people feel very alone in the church. And so I think it's up to local community to see, well, how can we foster this sense of family, sense of community in our parish, in our communities? I think that's number 2. Number 3 is, I think, I was asked just recently about what you can do politically. Sometimes we don't like war, we don't like some of the moral issues that are coming up. It might be abortion, it might be assisted suicide, or whatever it is. And some lady asked me, well, what can I do? Well, I said, again, get some people like you who think like this and write to your MP. If he doesn't like it or does nothing, then tell him you're going to make a fuss. And there's nothing like strong women to make a fuss. And you can do it in your street, in your community. And I do think we're powerless. And when I said, a Franciscan revolution you started, I really do think that the constitution of the lay people in the church gives the opportunity and the encouragement or the vocation of lay people to use it, each in a different way. So I think we need to kind of let fly the lay initiatives, the lay authority given to them by Christ and the Holy Spirit to think themselves as a community what they can do, not just to live a deeper Christian life themselves, but how to change the society in their local area and perhaps nationally as well. I can think of many instances where this happens, and I'm sure the same would be true here. I could go on, but I think that's enough. Thank you.
Your Eminence told us that your episcopal motto comes from the pastoral constitution of the Church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes. A little later in that document, it makes a point which underlies much of what I think you have said this afternoon. The future of humanity, the document tells us, is in the hands of those who can hand on to posterity grounds for living and for hope. For us as Catholic Christians, those grounds for living and for hope are found in the life and teaching of Jesus Christ, the incarnate Word. However, bringing people to Christ and Christ to them is inseparable from the Church. That, as we have heard, is the realization to which Malcolm Muggeridge eventually came. The question which your speech raises for me is this: how do we best explain the Church so that we can be effective witnesses to Christ, to the culture in which we find ourselves? The problem has been identified by the theologian Nicholas Lash in this way. Our contemporary culture has become so disengaged from the language and symbols of Christianity that it is becoming impossible either to hear or to speak the Christian message in a way that makes sense. Therefore, describing the Church as mother, teacher, sacrament, or in any one of the many other ways that we within the Church may care to do so, can fail to be understood in a time when individualism and relativism are so dominant. The spiritual seeker, however, is likely to identify the Church as institution, something which our culture says must be approached with scepticism and caution. Now, I happen to agree with Lord Clark in the quotation that Father Michael ended his introduction with earlier this afternoon. Institutions are important. It's my privilege to spend most of my day in the service of the institutions of justice. They are essential to our society. And the Church is an institution. But how do we present it as being attractive, as being trustworthy, and as being, above all else, truth-bearing? I would like to suggest that the way we should understand and present the Church is through the Mass. It is the worshipping Church, which then goes out to witness in word and deed, that I think will attract those seekers the Cardinal has talked about. I think this is the point the Holy Father made in his recent German television interview when he said this: "It is the liturgy that leads me to express the basic message of faith." The Mass is the primary place where we can encounter and offer to others those experiences of family, silence, and contemplation of which the Cardinal has spoken this afternoon. It is also the Mass which offers meaning. Timothy Radcliffe, OP, puts it this way: "Every Eucharist is a celebration of our trust that in Christ meaning will triumph. It is the conviction that all we hope for, happiness and sorrow, victory and defeat, will be found to have some sense. It is the ultimate and unimaginable victory of meaning." Cardinal Cormac told us about his encounter with the Archbishop of Prague, Cardinal Vulk. I'd like to conclude by recalling Cardinal Vulk's great predecessor, Joseph Cardinal Beran, who passed the last years of his ministry in exile in Rome, forbidden by the Czech authorities from returning to his homeland. Shortly after the Soviets suppressed the 1968 Prague Spring, a university student named Jan Palach set himself alight in the main square of Prague to protest against the Soviet invasion. There was great concern that Palach's funeral would start a popular uprising that would only lead to more innocent bloodshed. In an effort to calm the situation, the elderly Beran, himself only a few months from death, made a famous broadcast from Rome over Vatican radio. He ended with these words from Isaiah, which I think resonate with what the Cardinal has said today. "In silentio et spe erit fortitudo vestra." Your strength will be in silence and in hope. The silent contemplation of Christ in the Paschal Mystery is the source of our hope. That hope in turn gives us the strength, one might even say grace, to love and engage with the world as we find it, to witness in that world to our faith, and thereby to make Christ present in it, the Christ who Gaudium et Spes says fully discloses humankind to itself and unfolds its noble calling by revealing the mystery of the Father and the Father's love. For my question to Cardinal Cormac, I'd like to move a little northwest from Prague and go back to the Polish tailors, to the final point that it all begins at home. Your Eminence has said that the best spiritual nourishment is to meet people whose lives have been deeply affected by contemplating Jesus. Could you perhaps tell us about a couple of the people who you have encountered and who have impressed you as fitting the description of having been deeply affected by contemplating Christ?
I think all of us will have met people in our communities who have deeply impressed one. I'd like to perhaps mention 3 people who have deeply affected me, and all 3 will be known to, I think, most of you, perhaps all of you, because they're so well known. The first is Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who I met a number of times. And what impressed me about Mother Teresa was her down-to-earth matter-of-factness and her contemplation of Jesus. And her love for the poor. She was asked once by a journalist, Mother Teresa, here are these thousands and thousands of children dying on the streets in Calcutta. What could you do in front of all that? She said, how will you help them? He asked. She said, one by one. Now, she also said, God hasn't called me to be successful. God has called me to be faithful. Very, very important. Mother Teresa just seemed to incarnate for me the times I met her and obviously what I've read about her. That combination of faith and prayer, contemplation of Jesus with her life for the poor, which is why I think she was such an attractive person for so many people, not just Christians, but also others. Another person in the same mold was somebody, I think one of the greatest Englishmen of the last 100 years, a man called Leonard Cheshire. Leonard Cheshire started, as you know, he was in the Air Force during the war, and a group captain, was one of those who dropped the atom bomb on Nagasaki, but became a Catholic after the war as a result of nursing some ex-aircraft man who had cancer, and then decided he would give his life to opening these homes for disabled people. And now I think, I don't know, there are 200 or 300 of them. But I met him on a number of times. And every time I met him, he, again, a practical man who did all, but also he gave a couple of hours each day to prayer. And he always seemed to have something else on his mind. In fact, when I was rector of the English College in Rome, he came twice to Rome, I invited him to lunch each time, and he was sitting opposite me, and we were talking away and eating our pasta. And so he suddenly leaned across and said, Monsignor, could I ask you a question? So I said, sure. He said, could you tell me what is the church's teaching about angels? So I kept on eating my pasta and looked around at all the others and tried to give an answer. And the second time he asked me, this is in the middle of what the church is teaching about original sin. I tried to give him the answer, but just speaking to him, he was a man of this world, but not of this world. He was a man of deep prayer, deep care for others. He really impressed me enormously. He was a lovely man. He's dead now. The third person who, somebody asked me just recently, who's your favorite pope? Because I've lived as many of us have, under 6 popes, starting, I suppose, with Pius XI and Pius XII, and then Pope John and Pope Paul and Pope John Paul I and Pope John Paul II and now Pope Benedict. But anyway, I'm going to pick up one of the popes who always touched me, Pope John. I met him first. I said I met him. I didn't really. It was, as you remember, he was rather short and stout. I was on a little holiday in Venice in 1956, and I went to Mass at the St. Mark's with some other students. And he, as Cardinal Patriarch of Venice, was presiding at the Mass, and the Archbishop of Milan, who was a man called Montini, was saying the Mass. So anyway, we went to the Mass, and afterwards they both came out of the balcony. And the great Italian crowd outside, it was the big feast day, so they all gave him a clap. But he immediately stepped back, and he pushed Archbishop Montini, pushed him forward and said to the crowd, you clap him, he's going to be the next pope. But of course, he wasn't. And the story I'm going to tell you about Pope John, who was such a lovely, simple, prayerful, hopeful man, is this. He had a birthday, his 80th birthday, and he asked all the people in the Vatican to come in to celebrate it with him, but also a little group from his little village of Sotto il Monte in the north of Italy. Anyway, the hall was pretty crowded with cardinals and archbishops and monsignori and so on. But anyway, Pope John comes in. And he says, I'd like to speak to you all, but first of all, I want to speak to this little group who've come all the way from Sotto il Monte. They were peasant people in their Sunday best, looking a bit uncomfortable amongst all the bigwigs. So Pope John said, dear friends, thank you so much for coming to wish me a happy birthday. And he said, if things were different, I'd like to take you all out to a little ristorante and we'd have some pasta and some vino and we'd talk about old times. But he said, we can't always do what we want to do. He said, when I was a young man, I left Sotto il Monte and I went to the seminary, and it was very cold and the food was rotten, and I used to say to myself, Angelo, his name was Angelo Roncalli, Angelo, this is no place for you. But then I thought to myself, well, God's brought me here, I must stay and persevere. So I was ordained and a priest, and then very shortly I became the bishop's secretary. And I used to drive him around and carry his bags and do this and that, and often I'd say to myself, Angelo, this is no place for you. I'm sorry, Father Mark, about that. But then, as time went on, he said, I was asked to join the Vatican diplomatic service. And he said, I went here and there, to Bulgaria and to Turkey, and I was there for years, and I used to get messages from the Vatican to do this and to say that, and I used to often, it was very boring, he said, and I used to say often, Angelo, this is no place for you. But at last, he said, I was made Patriarch, Archbishop of Venice, and I was very happy. And I thought, at last, I'm going to be able to do what I've always wanted to do, which is to be a shepherd to my flock, to my people, to be a pastor. And I wanted to be a good shepherd. And so I went. And then he said, my predecessor, Pope Pius XII, died. And I was 77. Anyway, I went down to the conclave. And as I went into the conclave to elect the new pope, I said to myself, Angelo, they wouldn't, would they? He said, but they did. He said, and here I am, he said, surrounded by cardinals and bishops and monsignori, and I'd much prefer to be with all of you, talking about old times and having a festa together. But then this was his message. He said, we can't always do what we want to do. He said, and God's brought you where you are, and he's brought me where I am. And we must trust him, that it's all for the good, for his purposes. And I've always taken that message from Pope John, that God has brought all of you, whatever your circumstances, where you are, just as he's brought me where I am. And we must trust him, that beneath all the mysteries of life, the good Lord has his purposes, which will be fulfilled. And our trust must be in him. Thank you.